Tyre. Throughout human history, countless events, civilizations, and individuals have shaped the world we live in today, from the rise and fall of empires to groundbreaking discoveries and cultural revolutions. Every moment in the past has left its mark on our present and our future. By exploring history, we gain valuable insights into how societies have evolved, how ideas have spread, and how people have overcome challenges across time. In this video, we'll take a closer look at one chapter of our shared human story, uncovering the facts, contexts, and lessons that continue to resonate today. The Phoenicians were a seafaring people of ancient history whose influence extended across the Mediterranean through trade, colonization, innovation, and cultural exchange, emerging around 1500 BCE on the narrow coastal strip of the eastern Mediterranean, primarily in what is now Lebanon and parts of coastal Syria and northern Israel. The Phoenicians were not a single unified nation, but rather a collection of city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, each with its own local governance, but all sharing a common culture, language, religion, and economic purpose, hemmed in by the Lebanon mountains to the east and the Mediterranean Sea to the west. The Phoenicians lacked large tracts of arable land and abundant natural resources, especially compared to their neighbors in Mesopotamia or Egypt. This geographical constraint became a blessing in disguise as it pushed the Phoenicians toward the sea. With limited room to expand on land, they turned to maritime enterprise and developed extraordinary skills in shipbuilding, navigation, and long-distance commerce. These skills enabled them to become the preeminent traders of the ancient world, establishing connections that would span from the Levant to North Africa, and from the Aegean to the Iberian Peninsula, though the Phoenicians left behind few written records of their own, largely due to the perishability of the materials they used for writing and the eventual conquest and assimilation of their culture into larger empires. Their legacy can be traced through archaeological evidence, foreign historical records, and the cultural footprints they left throughout the Mediterranean. The Greek historian Herodotus referred to the Phoenicians as red people, likely referencing the distinctive purple dye that became their hallmark. This dye, derived from the murex sea snail, was labor-intensive and expensive to produce, which made it a luxury item reserved for royalty and elites across the ancient world. The Phoenicians' mastery in producing and trading this dye contributed significantly to their fame and economic power. In fact, the term Phoenician is derived from the Greek phoenikes, which itself means purple, alluding to the color that became synonymous with wealth and prestige. Culturally and linguistically, the Phoenicians belonged to the Northwest Semitic language group, closely related to Hebrew and Aramaic. Their greatest contribution to human civilization is, arguably, the development of the alphabetic writing system, a groundbreaking innovation that replaced complex writing systems such as Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform with a simpler, more adaptable script. This writing system, composed of 22 consonantal letters, was phonetic in nature and made literacy more accessible. The Phoenician alphabet was adopted and adapted by the Greeks, who added vowels. And from the Greek alphabet came the Latin alphabet, the one used today in most of the Western world. Thus, through this writing innovation, the Phoenicians laid the foundation for modern written communication. Phoenician city-states were strategically located along trade routes that connected them to powerful civilizations like Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, and the Aegean and Anatolian regions to the north. Byblos, one of the earliest and most important Phoenician cities, was a major hub for the export of papyrus and earned its name from the Greek word for book, biblion. Trade was the lifeblood of Phoenician civilization. Unlike empires that expanded through military conquest, the Phoenicians expanded their influence primarily through commerce. They built a vast trading network that extended across the Mediterranean Sea. Their merchants carried not only goods but also ideas, technologies, art styles, and religious practices. This web of commerce made Phoenicia a melting pot of cultures and a conduit for civilizational exchange. The Phoenicians traded a variety of goods, including timber from the cedar forests of Lebanon, renowned for its durability and strength, which made it ideal for shipbuilding and temple construction. Other exports included fine textiles dyed with their famous purple dye. Glassware included fine textiles dyed with their famous purple dye. Glassware, ivory carvings, pottery, jewelry, and metalwork. In return, they imported gold, silver, copper, tin, wine, spices, and foodstuffs from distant lands. Their trading expeditions took them to Egypt, Cyprus, Crete, Greece, Anatolia, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and as far west as the Iberian Peninsula. They established trading posts and colonies along these routes, the most famous of which was Carthage. Founded around 814 BCE in present-day Tunisia, Carthage would later rise to become one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. Rivaling Rome itself in the Punic Wars, colonization was a key aspect of the Phoenician expansion. Unlike imperial conquest, their colonization was primarily commercial. Colonies served as resupply stations, trade outposts, and hubs for local commerce. These colonies maintained cultural and religious ties with their mother cities in Phoenicia and contributed to the spread of Phoenician culture and language. Across the Mediterranean, Carthage, for example, preserved and expanded Phoenician traditions, becoming a major naval and economic power in its own right. Other notable colonies included Gades, modern Cadiz in Spain, Lixus in Morocco, and Utica in North Africa. The Phoenicians often established these colonies on peninsulas or small islands close to the coast for defensive advantages and ease of maritime communication. Religion was central to Phoenician life. They were polytheistic and worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, many of whom bore similarities to the deities of neighboring cultures. Major deities included Baal, a storm and fertility god, Astarte, a goddess of love and war associated with the Mesopotamian Ishtar, and Melkart, the patron god of Tyre and later of Carthage. Often equated with Hercules by the Greeks and Romans, temples dedicated to these deities were centers of worship, economic activity, and civic life. Religious rituals included offerings, sacrifices, and festivals. Some accounts suggest that child sacrifice was occasionally practiced in extreme religious contexts, particularly in Carthage, though the extent of this practice is debated among scholars. Despite their wealth and cultural sophistication, the Phoenician city-states were politically fragmented and often vulnerable to foreign domination. Throughout their history, they came under the sway of larger empires such as Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia. These empires imposed tribute and sometimes stationed governors in Phoenician cities, but they generally allowed a degree of local autonomy in exchange for economic cooperation. Under Persian rule, for instance, Phoenician ships and sailors played a crucial role in the imperial navy. The political fragmentation of Phoenicia meant that no single city-state could dominate the others for long, leading to a competitive and dynamic urban culture where commerce thrived and innovation flourished. Over time, Phoenician influence waned as their cities were absorbed into successive empires. Tyre was famously besieged and conquered by Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. After a lengthy and difficult campaign, by the end of the Hellenistic period, Phoenicia had become part of the Roman Empire, and its cities gradually lost their distinct identity. However, the legacy of the Phoenicians lived on through the enduring impact of their language, trade networks, cultural diffusion, and colonization efforts. As Phoenician city-states gradually fell under the control of foreign empires, their political independence was diminished, yet their economic and cultural vitality persisted for many centuries. Even under the rule of powerful empires such as Assyria and Babylonia, the Phoenicians retained their reputation as the premier shipbuilders, navigators, and merchants of the ancient Near East. The Assyrians, who were known for their military prowess and territorial ambition, recognized the strategic importance of the Phoenicians and often relied on their maritime expertise to build and maintain fleets, transport goods, and conduct naval campaigns. The Phoenician cities paid heavy tribute to their Assyrian overlords, but in return, they were permitted to continue their trade operations and maintain a degree of self-rule. This pragmatic arrangement benefited both parties. The Assyrians gained access to Mediterranean trade and naval logistics, while the Phoenicians were allowed to flourish economically despite political subjugation. The relationship between empire and merchant city was one of mutual benefit, at least until excessive tribute wars or changing political fortunes disrupted the balance. By the time of the Babylonian and later Persian conquests, Phoenicia had already become deeply integrated into a broader imperial system, yet its cities remained cultural and commercial hubs. The Persian Empire, under rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius I, maintained a tolerant and strategic approach to governance. They viewed Phoenician maritime skills as invaluable to their imperial ambitions, especially in naval warfare and overseas communication. Persian kings not only tolerated but supported Phoenician autonomy in return for naval support. Phoenician ships and crews played a significant role in Persian campaigns against Egypt and Greece. The Persian kings entrusted Phoenician admirals with commanding fleets that patrolled the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, showcasing the degree of confidence they placed in their seafaring capabilities. Thus, during this time, Phoenician influence reached a peak not through territorial expansion, but through strategic integration into the operations of one of the largest empires in history. In terms of material culture, the Phoenicians were exceptional artisans whose influence spread through their commercial networks. Phoenician glassmaking was among the finest in the world, and they are often credited with major advances in glassblowing techniques. Their decorative arts included intricate ivory carvings, metalwork, and jewelry that were prized far beyond their homeland. Phoenician artisans often combined motifs from Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Aegean art, reflecting their exposure to various cultures through trade. Their ability to absorb, adapt, and re-export these artistic traditions made their goods highly attractive in foreign markets. Likewise, Phoenician architectural styles such as the use of monumental stone construction and elaborately carved temple facades left their mark on the cities they traded with and settled in. Excavations at sites such as Tyre and Sidon have revealed well-planned urban layouts, harbor installations, and complex drainage systems, suggesting a high degree of urban sophistication. Religious influence also spread with the Phoenicians. As they founded colonies, they brought their gods with them, building temples and sanctuaries that mirrored those in their homeland. For example, Melkart, the god of Tyre, became the chief deity of Carthage and was later interpreted by the Greeks as equivalent to Heracles. This practice of religious continuity helped reinforce Phoenician identity across distant colonies and provided a shared spiritual framework that bound the diaspora together. Temples also functioned as economic centers and sometimes as banks, offering loans and safe deposits for merchants. Religious rituals and festivals brought communities together, and trade fairs often coincided with religious events, intertwining commerce with worship in a manner typical of ancient urban centers. The Phoenicians' contributions to navigation and exploration are among their most impressive achievements. They are believed to have been among the first to use the North Star for navigation, enabling them to sail at night and venture far beyond the sight of land. Their ships, such as the Galloway round cargo ships and the Byram's long warships with 2 rows of oars, were marvels of engineering for their time. These vessels allowed them to conduct trade missions that spanned thousands of kilometers. According to ancient sources, Phoenician mariners may have even circumnavigated Africa under Egyptian sponsorship during the reign of Pharaoh Necho II around 600 BCE. Though modern historians debate the accuracy of this claim, still, their reputation as fearless and competent sailors was legendary in antiquity. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Phoenician influence is the profound legacy of their alphabet. As previously noted, their writing system was revolutionary because it represented sounds, phonemes, rather than ideas, as in hieroglyphics, or syllables, as in cuneiform. This made it dramatically easier to learn and reproduce, which helped promote literacy among non-elites and facilitated record-keeping in commercial transactions. It spread rapidly across the Mediterranean, adopted and modified by the Greeks, who added vowels to represent their own spoken language, and subsequently by the Etruscans and Romans. The Latin alphabet, which developed from the Greek script, is a direct descendant of the Phoenician system. Thus, the very letters used to write this paragraph owe their origin to Phoenician scribes who, seeking to simplify writing for commercial purposes, accidentally birthed one of the most transformative tools in human communication in daily life. The Phoenicians were a pragmatic and cosmopolitan people. Their cities teemed with merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and administrators. Urban life revolved around the harbor, where ships from across the Mediterranean arrived daily. Markets bustled with goods from far-flung lands, and contracts were drawn, signed, and stored in archives. Houses in Phoenician cities were typically built from stone and mud brick, and city layouts were designed to accommodate both residential and commercial activities. Streets were narrow, winding, and often bustling with life. The upper classes lived in more elaborate homes, sometimes with multiple stories, interior courtyards, and ornate furnishings. Education, though not universally available, was important for merchants and scribes who needed to keep records and communicate with trading partners. While their own historical texts have largely been lost, possibly due to being written on perishable materials or destroyed during wars, they, Phoenicians, are mentioned frequently in Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylon, Hebrew, Greek, and Roman sources. The Hebrew Bible refers to Phoenicians several times, especially in the context of King Hiram of Tyre, who supplied cedar wood and craftsmen for the construction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Greek myths and literature are also filled with references to Phoenician characters, often casting them as exotic, wealthy, and mysterious. Europa, the mythological figure from whom Europe derives its name, was said to be a Phoenician princess abducted by Zeus. Cadmus, another figure of myth, was a Phoenician credited by the Greeks with bringing the alphabet to Thebes. These stories, while mythical, reflected deep awareness of Phoenician cultural influence among their contemporaries. As centuries passed, however, the Phoenicians' independence eroded. The campaigns of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE marked a major turning point. Tyre, one of the most powerful Phoenician cities, resisted Alexander's advances and suffered a brutal siege that ended in its destruction. Sanitation was a challenge in densely populated areas, but cities had cisterns, drainage systems, and water reservoirs to supply fresh water. Public baths and communal wells were likely part of the urban infrastructure. Markets were central to Phoenician cities and served as the social and economic hubs of daily life. These vibrant centers brought together people of all classes, ages, and professions. Merchants displayed goods such as fine textiles, carved ivory, intricately made glass, dyed garments, fragrant resins, wine, olive oil, spices, and pottery. The aroma of exotic spices mixed with the scent of roasted meats and sea air, as local cooks sold warm food to passers-by. Street vendors shouted their wares. Children played in the alleys and ships. Crews bargained for supplies. Trade was not only conducted with fellow Phoenicians, but also with foreign sailors, Egyptian officials, Greek traders, and others from across the Mediterranean. This exposure to foreign goods and cultures added a rich cosmopolitan flair to daily life, making cities like Tyre and Sidon famous melting pots of civilizations. The harbor was perhaps the most dynamic and vital space in any Phoenician city. The Phoenicians' advanced shipbuilding techniques made them masters of the sea, and their harbors were marvels of engineering. Docks were lined with merchant ships, biremes fishing boats, and foreign vessels. Workers unloaded amphorae filled with wine and oil, heavy sacks of grain, and crates filled with precious metals and exotic animals. The constant movement of cargo, shouting of dock workers, and sound of sails flapping in the wind formed a rhythm that reflected the heartbeat of the city. Sailors spent their mornings repairing sails, preparing their ships or discussing weather and trade routes. The harbor was also a place where ideas and information flowed freely. Sailors and traders brought news from distant lands, stories of politics, war, inventions, and gods. This exchange of knowledge kept Phoenician society ever curious and outward-looking. Homes were organized around family life, and kinship played an essential role in social identity. Extended families often lived close together, helping each other in daily tasks and working in family-run businesses. Family honor and reputation were paramount, especially among the merchant classes, and maintaining a good name could influence everything from marriage prospects to trade partnerships. The eldest male typically acted as the head of the household and made key decisions, but women had a respected role in managing domestic affairs. Homes of the wealthier class had separate rooms for cooking, dining, and sleeping, as well as open courtyards where much of the family's daily life took place. These courtyards were used for weaving, teaching children, hosting guests, or practicing small-scale crafts. Poorer families lived in simpler homes but still maintained strong family bonds and a sense of pride in their heritage. Clothing reflected social class, occupation, and even geographic location. The Phoenicians favored light, flowing garments due to the Mediterranean climate. Men typically wore tunics tied with belts, while women wore long dresses that could be plain or richly embroidered, depending on status. The famed purple dye, made from the murex snail, was a Phoenician invention and was reserved for the elite due to its labor-intensive production and rarity. Wearing purple was a status symbol, not only in Phoenicia but throughout the ancient world. Jewelry made of gold, silver, glass, and semi-precious stones was worn by both men and women. Bracelets, earrings, amulets, and rings were not only decorative but also served as talismans believed to offer protection from evil or illness. Children often wore charms shaped like gods or animals for similar reasons. Music, art, and entertainment were woven into the cultural fabric of Phoenician society. Music accompanied religious ceremonies, feasts, and even daily labor. Instruments like lyres, drums, flutes, and stringed harps were common. Professional musicians and dancers performed in public gatherings or private celebrations. Artisans painted pottery with scenes of daily life, mythology, and trade, and sculptors carved religious statues and decorative panels for temples. Glassmaking, one of their signature crafts, was both functional and artistic. Phoenicians were the first to blow glass into intricate shapes, and these delicate items were used in homes and sold in international markets. Storytelling was a beloved pastime, and oral traditions kept myths, history, and moral lessons alive. Elders often served as storytellers, recounting tales of heroes, gods, ancestors, and famous voyages. Health and medicine in Phoenician daily life were a mix of practical remedies and religious practices. Most medical knowledge was passed down through generations and based on experience, herbal lore, and observation. Healers and midwives were common in communities and often relied on natural ingredients such as honey, olive oil, herbs, and animal products to treat wounds, fevers, and digestive issues. Illnesses were sometimes seen as the result of displeased gods or spirits, and people would turn to priests for purification rituals or temple healing. Public hygiene, while not sophisticated by modern standards, was considered important. Clean water was fetched from wells or cisterns, and communal washing spaces or small baths may have existed in larger towns. The Phoenicians were exposed to medical ideas from Egypt and Mesopotamia through trade and diplomacy, and this exchange likely enriched their understanding of medicine. Religious life deeply influenced moral behavior, family customs, and city regulations. The Phoenicians practiced rituals and sacrifices to gain the favor of gods who controlled elements such as the sea, fertility, war, and prosperity. Shrines were located not only in temples but also in homes, marketplaces, and near ports. Melkart, the god of kings and sea trade, was especially important in Tyre, while Astarte, associated with fertility and love, was widely worshipped with rites that could include offerings of incense, wine, or animals. Religious festivals brought entire communities together and included processions, music, dramatic reenactments, and feasting. Some cities observed specific rituals related to the change of seasons, harvests, or celestial events. Priests and priestesses had significant influence, and temples often held large amounts of wealth in the form of donated goods, land, or treasure. Temples also served as cultural and educational centers where learning was passed down alongside spiritual knowledge. Festivals and public holidays were among the most anticipated events in Phoenician society. These celebrations were often tied to the agricultural calendar, religious deities, or significant historical events such as the founding of a city or the return of a victorious ship. During such festivals, citizens decorated the streets, dressed in colorful clothes, and prepared elaborate meals. There were parades featuring musicians, dancers, and priests carrying statues of gods. Public feasts were held where even the poor were invited to share food and drink. Children played games, and adults participated in competitions, storytelling, and theatrical performances. These festivals reinforced social bonds, united people across class lines, and gave everyone a chance to express gratitude to the gods for their blessings. They also functioned as a release from daily hardships and provided hope for future prosperity. Phoenician children were nurtured with great care and educated according to their family's status and profession. In elite households, boys were trained in literacy, mathematics, navigation, and trade languages such as Egyptian, Aramaic, and Greek. Girls were educated in domestic arts but could also receive lessons in reading, religion, and music. Children were taught to respect the gods, honor their parents, and carry on family traditions. Boys of merchant families often accompanied their fathers on short trade journeys, gradually learning the skills of negotiation and cultural diplomacy. As Phoenician city-states gradually fell under the control of foreign empires, their political independence was diminished, yet their economic and cultural vitality persisted for many centuries. Even under the rule of powerful empires such as Assyria and Babylonia, the Phoenicians retained their reputation as the premier shipbuilders, navigators, and merchants of the ancient Near East. The Assyrians, who were known for their military prowess and territorial ambition, recognized the strategic importance of the Phoenicians and often relied on their maritime expertise to build and maintain fleets, transport goods, and conduct naval campaigns. The Phoenician cities paid heavy tribute to their Assyrian overlords, but in return, they were permitted to continue their trade operations and maintain a degree of self-rule. This pragmatic arrangement benefited both parties. The Assyrians gained access to Mediterranean trade and naval logistics, while the Phoenicians were allowed to flourish economically despite political subjugation. The relationship between empire and merchant city was one of mutual benefit, at least until excessive tribute, wars, or changing political fortunes disrupted the balance. By the time of the Babylonian and later Persian conquests, Phoenicia had already become deeply integrated into a broader imperial system, yet its cities remained cultural and commercial hubs. The Persian Empire, under rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius I, maintained a tolerant and strategic approach to governance. They viewed Phoenician maritime skills as invaluable to their imperial ambitions, especially in naval warfare and overseas communication. Persian kings not only tolerated but supported Phoenician autonomy in return for naval support. Phoenician ships and crews played a significant role in Persian campaigns against Egypt and Greece. the Persian kings entrusted Phoenician admirals with commanding fleets that patrolled the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean, showcasing the degree of confidence they placed in their seafaring capabilities. Thus, during this time, Phoenician influence reached a peak not through territorial expansion, but through strategic integration into the operations of one of the largest empires in history. In terms of material culture, the Phoenicians were exceptional artisans whose influence spread through their commercial networks. Phoenician glassmaking was among the finest in the world, and they are often credited with major advances in glassblowing techniques. Their decorative arts included intricate ivory carvings, metalwork, and jewelry that were prized far beyond their homeland. Phoenician artisans often combined motifs from Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Aegean art, reflecting their exposure to various cultures through trade. Their ability to absorb, adapt, and re-export these artistic traditions made their goods highly attractive in foreign markets. Likewise, Phoenician architectural styles such as the use of monumental stone construction and elaborately carved temple facades left their mark on the cities they traded with and settled in. Excavations at sites such as Tyre and Sidon have revealed well-planned urban layouts, harbor installations, and complex drainage systems, suggesting a high degree of urban sophistication. Religious influence also spread with the Phoenicians. As they founded colonies, they brought their gods with them, building temples and sanctuaries that mirrored those in their homeland. For example, Melkart, the god of Tyre, became the chief deity of Carthage and was later interpreted by the Greeks as equivalent to Heracles. This practice of religious continuity helped reinforce Phoenician identity across distant colonies and provided a shared spiritual framework that bound the diaspora together. Temples also functioned as economic centers and sometimes as banks, offering loans and safe deposits for merchants. One of the most distinguishing features of Phoenician society was its openness to cultural exchange. Unlike many ancient civilizations that viewed foreigners with suspicion or sought isolation, the Phoenicians thrived on contact, cooperation, and adaptation. This open-minded approach extended into everyday life, from how they prepared food to how they conducted business. Phoenician cuisine, for example, was a reflection of this cultural fusion. Their meals combined local ingredients such as olives, lentils, barley, and goat cheese with spices and grains brought in from abroad. Bread, often baked in clay ovens or on hot stones, was a staple of every meal. Fish was abundant due to their proximity to the sea, and salted or dried fish was exported to foreign markets. Wine, stored in large amphorae, was consumed regularly by adults and often flavored with herbs. Meals were both practical and social experiences, with families gathering around low tables to share food, stories, and blessings to the gods. Hospitality to guests was seen as a sacred duty. Social mobility in Phoenician society, while not easy, was not entirely closed. Wealth and status were largely hereditary, but individuals with exceptional skills, such as shipbuilding, metalworking, or successful trading, could rise through the ranks and gain wealth and respect. The common sailor who became a successful merchant, for instance, could afford to build a fine home, send his children to be educated, or donate to temples. Artisans whose work became sought after in foreign courts could earn the patronage of nobles or even kings. In this way, the economy itself acted as a form of social engine, where talent, ingenuity, and ambition could sometimes overcome birth status. This was particularly true in port cities, where the fast pace of trade and constant need for skilled labor opened more opportunities than in purely agrarian societies. One of the major forces holding Phoenician daily life together was the structure and discipline of guilds. These were associations of workers or craftsmen organized around a specific trade, whether it was carpentry, dye making, glass blowing, or navigation. Guilds served multiple purposes. Economically, they regulated prices, ensured quality standards, and trained apprentices. Socially, they provided a sense of community, support in times of illness or death, and even mutual aid for families. Religiously, guilds often had their own patron deities and held their own festivals or rituals. Belonging to a guild was a mark of identity and pride, and membership was usually passed from father to son. These institutions gave structure to urban life and helped ensure the continuity of essential skills over generations. Another important aspect of Phoenician daily life was timekeeping and calendars. While the Phoenicians may not have developed a uniquely distinct calendar, they used a lunar system likely influenced by neighboring Mesopotamian and Egyptian systems. Months were marked by the phases of the moon, and days were divided by the movement of the sun. This timekeeping was essential for coordinating trade expeditions, religious ceremonies, and agricultural tasks. Special care was given to choosing auspicious dates for launching sea voyages, planting crops or performing sacred rituals. Temples often employed astrologers or priest astronomers who observed the heavens and advised leaders based on celestial phenomena. Astronomy played a practical role in navigation as well. Phoenician sailors relied on the stars to chart their routes across the open sea, a skill that gave them an unparalleled advantage in maritime trade. The political life of ordinary citizens varied by city-state, but generally involved a limited form of participation. While kings and councils held most of the power, local assemblies or citizen gatherings may have existed in some places to settle disputes, organize defense, or approve major construction projects. In smaller towns or colonies, elders or local leaders often made decisions with the input of respected families. Laws were passed down orally or inscribed on public walls, and justice was administered by appointed judges or priests. Legal systems were based on a combination of tradition, precedent, and divine authority. Property rights, trade agreements, and inheritance laws were well developed, as evidenced by clay tablets and stone inscriptions. Disputes could be settled by mediators, and oaths taken in the name of the gods were considered binding. Crime was viewed not just as a violation against another person, but also as a threat to the harmony of the city and its gods. Security and defense were important in Phoenician city life, especially given the competition between rival city-states and the constant threat of foreign invasion. Most cities had strong defensive walls, watchtowers, and guarded gates. City guards were responsible for maintaining order, collecting tolls, and defending the populace during sieges. Though the Phoenicians were not known for building vast empires, they were not defenseless. Each city maintained a militia or hired mercenaries for protection. Naval power also played a defensive role. Warships called byrems and triremes patrolled coastlines and escorted trade vessels. Phoenician sailors were not only merchants but sometimes acted as privateers, protecting their city's interests or attacking rival ships. Security within the city was also maintained by local watchmen, especially in markets, temples, and ports, where valuable goods changed hands daily. Spiritual beliefs shaped attitudes toward death and the afterlife, which in turn influenced burial practices and memorials. Unlike the Grand Pyramids of Egypt, Phoenician tombs were more modest but still rich in meaning. Burial customs varied by region and social class. The dead were usually interred in underground tombs or stone sarcophagi, sometimes accompanied by grave goods such as jewelry, weapons, tools, and food offerings. These items were believed to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Wealthier individuals had elaborate tombs with carvings and inscriptions, while common people were buried in simpler graves. Cemeteries were located outside city walls, and some tombs show clear influence from Egyptian or Mesopotamian burial styles, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of Phoenician beliefs. Ancestor worship may have existed, with families making offerings at grave sites or invoking the protection of forebears during important decisions. Environmental awareness also formed a part of daily life, though in a different sense than modern ecological concerns. The Phoenicians were deeply attuned to the rhythms of nature. Understanding tides, wind patterns, and seasonal changes was essential for navigation. Agriculture and fishing. Farmers respected the cycles of the earth and relied on local knowledge passed through generations to grow crops on limited land. Fishermen studied marine behavior to identify rich fishing grounds. Woodcutters and shipwrights relied heavily on Lebanon's famed cedar forests, though over time, deforestation became a serious concern, leading the Phoenicians to import wood from abroad. Some religious practices, such as sacred groves or water blessings, reveal a spiritual respect for natural elements like trees, rivers, and stars. These beliefs, although not ecological in a scientific sense, reflected an understanding of human dependence on natural forces. Entertainment and leisure in Phoenician society were communal and celebratory. In addition to festivals and music, people enjoyed a variety of board games and recreational activities. Dice games, stone games resembling checkers, and other tabletop pastimes were popular among children and adults alike. Athletic competitions may have been held during religious festivals, including races, wrestling, and strength contests. Public storytelling was both entertainment and education, preserving myths and moral tales. Theaters were not as prominent as in Greek cities, but performances of song and dance, especially during temple ceremonies or seasonal celebrations, provided community amusement. In coastal towns, beaches became informal social spaces where children played, fishermen mended nets, and neighbors gathered to chat under the sun. Even in colonial settlements far from Phoenicia, daily life retained strong cultural patterns. In Carthage, for instance, settlers lived in neighborhoods organized by craft or trade, built temples to Baal Hammon and Tanit, local versions of Phoenician gods, and continued speaking the Punic language, a derivative of Phoenician. Education Trade and religious customs in these colonies closely mirrored those in Tyre or Sidon, proving the strength of cultural continuity, yet local adaptation was also a hallmark. In North Africa, colonists adopted native farming practices, incorporated Berber words into their vocabulary, and modified their housing designs to fit the environment. This balance between preserving cultural roots and adapting to local conditions made Phoenician society one of the most flexible and resilient in the ancient world. Language was one of the most powerful unifying forces in Phoenician society. The Phoenician script, consisting of 22 consonantal letters, was a monumental innovation in the history of writing. It was simple, easy to learn, and far more accessible than complex cuneiform or hieroglyphic systems used in other regions. This script allowed a broader segment of the population, especially merchants, sailors, and scribes, to read and write efficiently. The Phoenician alphabet became the foundation for many later scripts, including Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. In daily life, writing was everywhere inscribed on tombstones, pottery, ship manifests, temple offerings, and merchant contracts. Literacy among the elite was encouraged, but even among the middle class of artisans and traders, the ability to read and write was considered essential. Young boys learned the alphabet from clay tablets or painted boards, often repeating the letters aloud in chant-like rhythms. The widespread use of this script helped maintain communication across vast trade routes and colonies, reinforcing a shared cultural identity among dispersed Phoenician communities. Phoenician cities had distinctive architectural styles influenced by geography, available materials, and foreign contexts. Stone and timber were commonly used in construction, with cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon playing a prominent role in temples, palaces, and ships. Houses were typically built close together due to the cramped terrain, and they often had flat roofs that served multiple purposes: sleeping under the stars during summer, drying fruits or fish, or gathering for family events. Wealthier homes had plastered walls, painted decoration, and internal courtyards that provided light and ventilation. Public buildings such as temples and markets were more elaborate, featuring columns, stairways, and carved inscriptions. Water management systems were sophisticated. Cisterns and aqueducts helped manage scarce water resources, while drainage channels protected the cities during seasonal rains. Even urban planning revealed a deep respect for order and functionality. Markets were located near gates. Harbors were strategically fortified, and main streets were laid out to maximize movement of people and goods. Marriage in Phoenician society was more than a private arrangement between two individuals. It was a union between families, often arranged to strengthen alliances, secure business partnerships, or maintain social standing. Dowries were common, consisting of land, money, household items, or livestock. The wedding ceremony included both legal and religious elements. Contracts were drawn up and sometimes witnessed by scribes or temple officials, while blessings were sought from gods such as Astarte, goddess of fertility and love, to ensure prosperity and children. Women typically moved into their husband's household, though their own family often remained closely involved in their lives. In elite circles, marriages could even be arranged between city-states or colonies to forge political ties. While male authority was emphasized, women retained certain rights, such as property, inheritance, and religious leadership roles. Family was the most central unit of Phoenician life, offering not only emotional support but also social security, economic collaboration, and cultural transmission. Family structure emphasized both unity and hierarchy. The eldest male, often the grandfather or father, served as the patriarch and was responsible for decision-making, settling disputes, and leading religious observances at home. Mothers managed the household, oversaw servants or slaves, and taught daughters domestic skills. Siblings worked together in business, crafts, or farming, while grandparents passed down oral histories and moral lessons. Extended families often lived in clusters, creating miniature communities within cities or villages. Children were raised with a strong sense of duty to their ancestors and gods, and disobedience was considered a social as well as spiritual offense. Special events such as births, name-giving ceremonies, and coming-of-age rituals were celebrated with feasts, music, and temple offerings. When a family member died, mourning customs included wearing dark garments, lighting oil lamps, and offering prayers for safe passage into the afterlife. Families also had the responsibility to care for their sick and elderly members. With no formal public welfare system in place, trade networks were not just economic lifelines. They shaped how people lived, what they wore, how they decorated their homes, and even what they believed. Goods from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, Anatolia, Greece, and beyond flowed through Phoenician ports. These included papyrus, ivory, tin, amber, spices, and exotic animals. As a result, a typical Phoenician home might contain Egyptian glass, Mesopotamian motifs on pottery, or Greek-style metalwork. This cultural mixing extended to religion. Foreign deities were occasionally worshipped or merged with Phoenician ones. For instance, the god Melkart was sometimes identified with the Greek Heracles. Religious syncretism enriched Phoenician spirituality and allowed them to engage diplomatically and commercially with multiple civilizations. Exposure to foreign architecture, clothing, and literature also influenced fashion and aesthetics back home. Phoenicians, while proud of their heritage, were highly pragmatic and welcomed foreign ideas that could enhance their way of life. Women's daily lives varied based on class and location. In rural areas, women worked in agriculture alongside their husbands tending gardens, collecting olives, spinning wool, and preparing meals from simple ingredients. In urban areas, elite women had more leisure time but were still expected to manage the household and uphold family honor. Many women played roles in business, especially textile production. Women were often in charge of spinning and weaving, dyeing fabrics, including the famous Tyrian purple, and selling finished garments in the marketplace. In religious contexts, women served as priestesses, ritual singers, or ceremonial dancers, especially in temples dedicated to goddesses like Astarte or Tanit. Some inscriptions suggest that women made religious offerings in their own names, an indicator of both autonomy and spiritual influence. While public political life was mostly male-dominated, women wielded quiet power in the realms of family, faith, and economy. Phoenician attitudes toward childhood were characterized by affection, protection, and structured upbringing. Birth was considered a sacred event, attended by midwives and accompanied by prayers to fertility gods. Infants were named shortly after birth, often after ancestors or gods. Amulets were placed near the child or sewn into clothing to ward off illness or evil spirits. Childhood was not purely a time of leisure. Children were expected to help with chores, learn family trades, and begin religious instruction early. Boys practiced using tools, accompanied fathers on errands, and learned to read using alphabet tablets. Girls helped in food preparation, weaving, and water fetching, preparing for their future roles as household managers. Games and toys were also part of daily life. Children played with dolls, spinning tops, whistles, and carved animals. Songs, riddles, and simple dances were used not just for fun but for learning vocabulary, values, and religious stories. Coming-of-age events marked the transition into adult responsibilities, often involving participation in public rituals or apprenticeships. Work rhythms in Phoenician cities followed a regular pace shaped by sun cycles, weather, and festivals. Artisans started their day at dawn, working with tools of bone, bronze, and iron to create everything from pottery to tools and luxury items. Merchants opened their stalls early, shouting prices and bargaining with buyers, while children fetched supplies and runners carried messages between shops. Fishermen returned from night trips and sold their catch in the harbor. Midday rest, especially during summer, was common in both city and countryside. In the afternoons, workshops resumed, and priests held ceremonies or led processions. At sunset, families gathered for meals, shared news, and recited prayers. By night, oil lamps lit the streets, especially near temples or wealthier homes. Stories, songs, and small community gatherings closed the day, often under the starlit sky that had guided their ancestors across the sea for generations. Despite the prosperity and cultural vibrancy of Phoenician cities, they were not immune to hardship. Famines caused by poor harvests or blocked trade routes could devastate communities. Drought, earthquake, and disease were also threats, especially in closely packed cities. When disaster struck, the people turned to their gods with increased sacrifices and processions, hoping to appease divine wrath. Political instability, either from rival city-states or foreign empires like the Assyrians and Babylonians, occasionally interrupted daily life. In times of siege or invasion, families fled to the countryside or fortified inner citadels. Yet the Phoenicians' resilience was legendary. They rebuilt their cities repeatedly, relocated their settlements when necessary, and adapted to new powers while preserving their core traditions. This ability to endure, adapt, and thrive in the face of challenges is one of the reasons Phoenician society left such a lasting mark on history. Long-distance trade, as an innovation of the ancient world, did not suddenly emerge but gradually unfolded over generations of human interaction, innovation, and exploration. The desire to acquire resources unavailable in one's immediate surroundings, combined with the curiosity to discover what lay beyond known frontiers, gave rise to a system of exchange that extended far beyond village markets and neighboring settlements. While early humans were largely self-sufficient within local economies, dependent on their immediate geography. The growing complexity of societies, particularly in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Levant, fostered new relationships between distant peoples. It was in this setting, amid bustling river valleys and rugged coastlines, that the seeds of long-distance trade were planted. Central to this unfolding story were the Phoenicians, a seafaring people who transformed commerce into an expansive and interconnected Mediterranean enterprise. Their unique ability to link disparate cultures through goods, language, and maritime skill turned them into the earliest pioneers of what would become global trade. The origins of long-distance trade are intertwined with humanity's earliest needs and ingenuity. In prehistoric times, the barter of tools, food, and materials occurred between nomadic groups and neighboring tribes, often over short distances. As societies settled and specialized, however, people began to produce surplus goods such as grain, pottery, or woven cloth. This surplus created the possibility and the necessity of exchange. From this simple system emerged complex trade relationships driven by both necessity and desire. Communities in mineral-rich regions like Anatolia or the Sinai Peninsula exchanged obsidian, copper, and turquoise with agricultural societies along the Nile or the Tigris. Gradually, routes formed across mountain passes, deserts, and eventually seas, bridging distant lands and peoples. Yet while overland trade was important, it was maritime trade that truly revolutionized distance commerce. The Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by a diverse mosaic of cultures, offered a natural highway for seafaring traders to link civilizations. And in the eastern reaches of that sea, the Phoenicians took to the waves with a vision that would shape the ancient world. The Phoenicians were not an empire in the traditional sense. Rather than ruling over vast inland territories, they operated as a confederation of independent city-states, most notably Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and later Carthage, each possessing its own political structure but united by culture, language, and economic ambition. The rugged coastline of modern-day Lebanon, where these cities were located, left little room for large-scale agriculture, encouraging the Phoenicians to turn their eyes to the sea. Surrounded by mountains rich in cedar and with natural harbors dotting the coast, they developed into expert shipbuilders and navigators, unlike the Egyptians, who focused on the Nile, or the Mesopotamians, whose energy was devoted to controlling rivers and canals. The Phoenicians saw the open sea as an opportunity, a realm not of fear, but of fortune. Their ships became the vehicles of a new age of commerce, connecting city to city, culture to culture, across the vast Mediterranean basin. The birth of long-distance trade in the Phoenician world was catalyzed by their mastery of seafaring technology. Phoenician vessels, such as the galley and later the bireme, were constructed with precision and durability, enabling them to withstand the perils of long sea voyages. They developed double-hulled ships for added storage, improved steering with the use of rudders, and used sails in tandem with rows of oarsmen for propulsion in all weather. These technological advancements allowed Phoenician traders to reach distant shores with relative safety and to return home with goods previously inaccessible to their homeland. It was this ability to traverse great distances that distinguished long-distance trade from local barter. Through open sea navigation and coastal hopping, Phoenician merchants reached the Aegean, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and even the coasts of Spain and possibly Britain. Every port they touched became a potential node in a growing web of trade. As Phoenician ships plied the waters of the Mediterranean, they carried goods, both exotic and practical glass beads, finely dyed textiles, olive oil, timber, incense, spices, wine, and metalwork. Of these, perhaps the most iconic was Tyrian purple, a vivid dye made from crushed murex snails, so rare and valuable that it was reserved for royalty and became a symbol of elite status in many cultures. This dye was not just a product, it was a symbol of the Phoenicians' economic reach and artisanal mastery. Alongside it traveled cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon, prized in Egypt and Mesopotamia for construction and shipbuilding. Fine Phoenician glassware and intricate jewelry also found eager buyers across the Mediterranean. The trade was not one-sided. Phoenician merchants returned home with silver from Spain, tin from Cornwall, grain from Egypt, and ivory from Africa. These exchanges did not only enrich the traders, they diversified and elevated entire economies. The mechanisms of long-distance trade required more than ships and goods. They demanded systems of measurement, language, law, and diplomacy. Here, too, the Phoenicians were innovators. Perhaps their most transformative contribution was their script, the Phoenician alphabet, consisting of a set of consonantal characters. It was more efficient and adaptable than the pictographic or syllabic scripts of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Merchants could now record transactions, track inventories, and communicate across linguistic boundaries with relative ease. The alphabet was quickly adopted and modified by the Greeks, later passed to the Romans, and forms the foundation of most modern Western writing systems. In this way, long-distance trade facilitated not just economic exchange, but the transmission of ideas and innovations that would shape global civilization. The social implications of long-distance trade were equally profound. Ports and coastal cities became cosmopolitan centers where people of different ethnicities, languages, and religions interacted. Markets buzzed with the sounds of haggling in multiple tongues, and streets were lined with goods from across the known world. The presence of foreign traders brought not only commodities, but also stories, technologies, artistic styles, and religious beliefs. This cultural diffusion helped to form early identities that were less tribal and more cosmopolitan. Phoenician city-states, although small in land area, became melting pots of culture where a traveler from Nubia, an artisan from Crete, and a merchant from Anatolia might all find a common language and trade. These interactions laid the groundwork for the multicultural dynamics that defined classical and later empires. The long-distance trade networks of the Phoenicians also had a significant political impact. Through their economic power, Phoenician city-states could influence foreign kings and local rulers, form alliances, and secure favorable trading rights. Unlike empires that sought dominion through conquest, the Phoenicians practiced a form of soft power through wealth and commerce. Their colonies, such as Carthage, were not imposed by military force but developed gradually through trade and settlement. In time, these outposts grew into powerful city-states in their own right, extending Phoenician influence even as the original cities faced political pressures from Assyrian and Babylonian forces. This method of expansion, commercial rather than imperial, proved highly effective in maintaining long-distance connections even in times of political turmoil. Importantly, long-distance trade required a deep understanding of geography and seasonal patterns. The Phoenicians were masters of early navigation, using the position of the stars, especially the North Star, to chart their courses. They observed currents, tides, and weather systems, creating mental maps and oral traditions that guided them across unknown seas. These skills allowed them to sail far beyond the sight of land, a remarkable feat for the ancient world. They also developed practical solutions for logistics, such as modular cargo design, standardized amphorae, and complex warehousing systems in major ports. These innovations ensured the efficient movement of goods, reduced losses, and increased the profitability of long voyages. In many ways, the logistical sophistication of the Phoenicians rivaled that of much later commercial empires. The reach of Phoenician trade began to transform the Mediterranean from a fragmented array of isolated cultures into a dynamic and integrated trading sphere. Every port the Phoenicians touched became not only a site for economic transaction, but a cultural node where ideas, languages, and beliefs could interact. As these commercial contacts grew more frequent, shared expectations and common standards developed across the region. The Phoenicians played a key role in shaping these norms, often acting as mediators between more powerful kingdoms. They maintained trading relationships with Egypt, whose demand for timber, incense, and foreign luxury goods had existed since the Old Kingdom. They also dealt extensively with the Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians in the east, as well as with the Greek city-states and Italic tribes in the west. In each interaction, the Phoenicians used diplomacy and gift-giving to cultivate trust and secure access to valuable ports and inland markets. These acts helped stabilize relations between otherwise hostile or distant powers, allowing trade to flourish even amid political rivalry. Carthage, the most famous Phoenician colony, came to embody the success and ambition of long-distance trade, founded by settlers from Tyre around the 9th century BCE. Carthage occupied a strategic position on the North African coast. From this hub, Phoenician traders could reach the western Mediterranean with greater ease, facilitating trade with Iberia, Gaul, and even the British Isles. Carthage soon developed into a commercial powerhouse in its own right, eventually eclipsing its parent cities in wealth and influence. It became not only a distribution center for Phoenician goods, but also a manufacturing city that produced its own ceramics, metal tools, and textiles. The Carthaginians maintained the traditions of their Phoenician ancestors, including their religion, writing system, and dedication to maritime trade. Through Carthage, the Phoenician legacy was preserved and projected across the ancient world. Even after many eastern city-states came under foreign control, what truly set long-distance trade apart from earlier forms of exchange was the volume, variety, and organization of goods in transit. Unlike local bartering, which dealt in small quantities of essential goods, Long-distance trade moved large shipments of luxury and specialty items over thousands of miles. Entire fleets of merchant vessels might carry amphorae filled with wine, olive oil, and fish sauce, metal ingots for crafting weapons and jewelry, fine linen, glass beads, and semi-precious stones. These goods were often warehoused in port cities, sorted, taxed, and resold through secondary markets. This created a complex network of producers, carriers, agents, and consumers, a true economic system. The Phoenicians' role within this system was not merely that of carriers, but of coordinators who understood regional supply and demand, predicted market trends, and adjusted their voyages accordingly. Another feature of long-distance trade was the growth of standardized systems. The need to ensure fairness and predictability in transactions prompted the Phoenicians to establish clear measurements of weight and volume, recognizable coinage, and written contracts. Though they initially operated without minted currency, they soon adapted to monetary exchange systems. Especially when trading with the Greeks, standard amphorae were used to transport liquids like wine and olive oil, each marked with symbols denoting volume and origin. These amphorae became so common that archaeologists today can use them to map out ancient trade routes. The presence of Phoenician-style amphorae and artifacts across the Mediterranean from Sardinia to Sicily, from Malta to Spain, stands as physical testimony to the far-reaching influence of their trading activities. Religion also played a powerful role in facilitating long-distance trade. The Phoenicians believed that divine forces protected their voyages and settlements. Temples dedicated to gods like Melkart, Astarte, and Baal served both spiritual and practical functions. Merchants made offerings before embarking on voyages, and temples often served as neutral ground for trade negotiations or as safe storage for goods and wealth. In foreign ports, Phoenician traders built shrines and temples to maintain divine favor and affirm cultural identity. These religious structures acted as beacons to other Phoenicians, assuring them of friendly territory and community support. This merging of spiritual belief and commercial practice helped integrate religion into daily business and reinforced cultural cohesion across great distances. Furthermore, long-distance trade changed the very structure of society in Phoenician cities. While older civilizations like Egypt or Mesopotamia had economies heavily reliant on agriculture and temple-based bureaucracy, Phoenician society increasingly revolved around commerce. Merchants, shipbuilders, sailors, artisans, and port officials formed a powerful economic class. Wealth was no longer strictly tied to land ownership or birthright. Successful traders could rise to prominence, influence civic affairs, and sponsor religious and cultural projects. This made Phoenician cities dynamic, upwardly mobile places, where skill and initiative were as valuable as noble lineage. The bustling harbors of Tyre, Sidon, and Carthage were centers of opportunity, where economic innovation could flourish. The long-distance trade networks established by the Phoenicians also influenced architecture and urban planning. As port cities grew to accommodate more vessels and larger warehouses, they developed infrastructure such as docks, piers, lighthouses, and markets. City walls were expanded to protect valuable goods, and custom houses regulated incoming and outgoing cargo. Ships were categorized by purpose, some designed for cargo, others for passengers, others for exploration or diplomacy. Shipyards and dry docks employed thousands of workers, from master carpenters to rope makers and sail weavers. These economic developments changed the physical landscape of Phoenician cities, giving them a distinct maritime character that reflected their global aspirations. In addition, the Phoenicians' role in the birth of long-distance trade influenced how other civilizations viewed and engaged with the sea. While some ancient peoples feared oceanic travel or limited their maritime activity to river and coastal transport, the Phoenicians embraced the sea as a corridor of connectivity. Their fearless voyages opened up routes previously unknown, allowing goods to reach further inland through a combination of maritime and overland caravans. Their influence encouraged other civilizations, especially the Greeks and later the Romans, to expand their own naval ambitions. In this way, Phoenician trade was not just a product of history, it was a shaper of it, pushing other cultures to engage more broadly with the world beyond their borders. The long-distance trade pioneered by the Phoenicians also had an unintended yet significant consequence: the birth of economic diplomacy. As they engaged with diverse peoples, the Phoenicians learned the importance of maintaining peace for the sake of profit. They developed multilingual capabilities, hired translators, and respected local customs in the cities they visited. Gift-giving, marriage alliances, and religious dedications were used to forge goodwill. In return, Phoenicians were granted privileges, access to markets, reduced taxes to markets, reduced taxes, and trade monopolies that extended their influence even in foreign lands. This diplomatic model, based on commerce rather than conquest, anticipated later practices used by merchant republics like Venice or international trading. Companies in the early modern period, ultimately the Phoenicians' contributions to the birth of long-distance trade reshaped the ancient world. Their daring sea voyages, technological innovations, and deep cultural flexibility allowed them to bind distant cultures into an early form of globalization. Their alphabet revolutionized record-keeping and communication. Their colonies laid the foundation for empires. Their goods enriched the palaces of kings, the homes of merchants, and the temples of priests across the ancient Mediterranean. In every amphora unearthed from a shipwreck, every inscription found in a distant trading post, every Phoenician coin or seal discovered in foreign soil, there echoes a story not just of trade, but of human ambition, courage, and connection. The birth of long-distance trade was not merely a chapter in history. It was a new way of imagining the world as a place of endless possibility, joined together by ships, ideas, and shared purpose. Among the many contributions of the Phoenicians to ancient civilization, one of the most striking and economically transformative was their discovery, refinement, and global trade in Tyrian purple, a luxurious dye extracted from the murex sea snail. Tyrian purple became not only a symbol of wealth and royal power, but also a powerful economic tool that helped elevate Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon to international prominence. This vibrant, rich, and remarkably color-fast dye was more than a commodity. It was a product of skilled labor, secrecy, ritual, and maritime expertise. Understanding the history of Tyrian purple is to understand the intersection of nature, commerce, craftsmanship, and culture in the ancient Mediterranean world. The story of this rare dye reflects how the Phoenicians used their environment and ingenuity to position themselves at the heart of a global trading network that linked east and west, spreading not only goods but ideas, art, and prestige. The origins of Tyrian purple can be traced to the eastern Mediterranean coast, specifically the rocky shores of modern-day Lebanon and parts of Syria and northern Israel, where the Phoenician civilization emerged around 1500 BCE. The term Phoenician itself is derived from the Greek word phoenix, meaning either purple or crimson, a reference to the famed dye they traded. The connection between their identity and their signature product underscores how integral Tyrian purple was to their culture, economy, and external reputation. Ancient sources such as Pliny the Elder and Aristotle mention the Phoenicians' use of the dye, describing its production methods and emphasizing its exceptional cost and exclusivity. The dye was extracted from the hypobranchial gland of two types of sea snails, Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus, which were abundant in the shallow sunlit waters of the Mediterranean but required immense labor to harvest and process. The process of creating Tyrian purple was labor-intensive, secretive, and malodorous, involving thousands of snails to produce even a small quantity of dye. Workers would gather Murex snails by hand or nets, crush the shells to access the gland, and then subject the glands to a complex fermentation process in large vats that lasted several days. The smell was so foul that dye workshops were located at the edges of cities or outside urban centers altogether. The glands secreted a milky fluid that, when exposed to sunlight and oxygen, turned from white to yellow, green, blue, and finally deep purple. The precise hue could vary from a reddish crimson to a deep violet depending on the type of snail used, the exact method of fermentation, and environmental factors. Skilled artisans controlled this process with remarkable precision. Tyrian purple was unique because it bonded chemically to fabrics like wool and linen, becoming brighter and more intense with age and washing rather than fading. This permanence made the dye especially desirable and revered. Because of its difficulty to produce in its radiant, non-fading color, Tyrian purple quickly became associated with status, divinity, and power. Only the elite could afford clothing dyed in this royal hue. Kings, emperors, and high-ranking officials wore it to distinguish themselves visually from the masses. In the ancient Near East, purple garments were reserved for temple priests and monarchs, symbolizing divinity and heavenly favor. The prestige of Tyrian purple extended into Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, Greece, and Rome. In ancient Egypt, purple-dyed cloths were sometimes buried with the dead, indicating the garment's value in both life and the afterlife. In Rome, it was declared by law that only the emperor could wear a toga entirely dyed with Tyrian purple toga picta, and violations were punishable by death. This legal restriction is a testament to the dye's role in reinforcing political hierarchy and divine rulership. The economic implications for the Phoenicians were profound. Tyrian purple became one of their most valuable exports, along with cedar wood, glass, and luxury goods. The demand for the dye extended across the ancient world, and Phoenician merchants established colonies and trade routes as far west as Carthage and the Iberian Peninsula to distribute it. The dye was not sold in bulk but in tightly sealed amphorae and stored in secure locations, with records and labels to indicate quality and provenance. Some archaeological sites have uncovered remnants of murex shells in massive quantities, indicating industrial-scale production. Tyre, in particular, became synonymous with the dye. In fact, some classical authors referred to it simply as Tyrian dye, blending the city's identity with its chief export. Tyrian purple's value was not merely economic but also cultural and symbolic. In a world where color was not easily obtained or preserved, the brilliance and rarity of the dye lent it spiritual associations. In Phoenician religious practices, garments worn by priests were sometimes dyed purple to emphasize their role as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. Purple's association with gods and kings endured through the millennia and became embedded in European, Middle Eastern, and later Christian traditions. Even the term "born to the purple," later used in Byzantium to denote imperial birthright, originated from this long-standing cultural association. The symbolic power of purple transcended its physical form, becoming a visual metaphor for legitimacy, honor, wealth, and divine approval. In the broader context of Phoenician trade, Tyrian purple functioned as a luxury item that opened doors to diplomatic relationships and commercial alliances. It was not only sold but often gifted to foreign rulers to secure treaties, favor, or access to local markets. The dye's exclusivity and mystique also ensured that knowledge of its production remained closely guarded among Phoenician craftsmen. Despite centuries of trade and the spread of Phoenician influence, few outsiders were able to replicate the production process until much later. This guarded secrecy served as a form of intellectual property and allowed the Phoenicians to maintain dominance over one of the most lucrative trades in the ancient world. The story of the Phoenicians is inseparable from the story of the ancient world's trade routes, both those that stretched eastward into the heartlands of Mesopotamia, Persia, and India, and those that reached westward into the Mediterranean basin and beyond. From the very beginnings of their civilization, the Phoenicians were not only seafarers but also masterful intermediaries, merchants who understood geography, demand, diplomacy, and the value of goods that could not be produced locally. Their geographical location on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, nestled between towering mountain ranges and the sea, made them a natural gateway between east and west. Their expertise in shipbuilding, navigation, and cross-cultural negotiation enabled them to establish, maintain, and expand one of the most influential and far-reaching trade networks of the ancient world. These networks facilitated not just the exchange of goods, but also the spread of technology, religious ideas, languages, art forms, and cultural practices, helping shape the very fabric of Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. At the core of the Phoenician trading system was their maritime prowess. Phoenician ships, especially their merchant vessels known as galloi, were designed to carry large cargo loads across long distances. These ships were broad, sturdy, and wind-powered, allowing them to cross open seas as well as hug coastlines when needed. Early on, the Phoenicians established trade links with neighboring societies such as the Egyptians, Hittites, and Mesopotamians. These interactions gradually expanded into broader and more complex networks. From Egypt, the Phoenicians obtained gold, papyrus, linen, and grain. In return, they provided cedar wood from Lebanon's forests, glassware from Sidon, intricately dyed textiles from Tyre, and luxurious items such as jewelry and ivory carvings. With the Hittites, the Phoenicians traded tools, weapons, and horses in exchange for wine, olive oil, and timber. Farther east, their caravans and ships carried goods to and from Babylon, Susa, and even regions that today are part of Iran and Afghanistan. Eastward trade routes often required combinations of overland and riverine travel. While the Phoenicians themselves preferred sea routes, they maintained partnerships with inland traders, especially Arameans, Assyrians, and later Persians, who helped facilitate the movement of goods. Through rugged terrain, spices, incense, rare minerals, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and silk-like fabrics from the east began appearing in Phoenician ports, hinting at early connections with India and perhaps even Western China. Though the Phoenicians did not personally travel the entire distance to India or China, their port cities acted as crucial nodes in what would later evolve into the Silk Road. Goods arrived in Phoenician hands after passing through many intermediaries, and the Phoenicians then brought them westward to Greece, Italy, North Africa, and Iberia. In this way, The Phoenicians played the essential role of cultural and commercial middlemen in a truly transcontinental economy. To the west, the Phoenicians established some of the earliest and most influential trade routes in the Mediterranean world. Their ships plied the waters of the Aegean Sea, bringing Levantine goods to Mycenaean Greece and later classical Greek city-states. Phoenician ports such as Byblos, Tyre, and Arwad served as launching points for expeditions that traveled westward to Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, and the Balearic Islands. These voyages were not only for trade, but often resulted in the establishment of trading posts and permanent colonies. Carthage in North Africa, perhaps the most famous of these colonies, grew into a powerful city-state that continued and expanded Phoenician trade traditions long after the original homeland city's decline. Carthage would later create its own trade routes into Western Africa, Iberia, and even beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, reaching the Atlantic coasts of what is now Portugal and Morocco. The Western trade routes were rich in resources and opportunities. The Phoenicians sought metals, especially silver, tin, and copper, which were rare in the east but abundant in regions like Iberia and Cornwall. These metals were essential for the production of bronze and other tools and weapons. They also traded for fish products, resins, wine, salt, and colored minerals. In return, they brought Eastern luxuries such as Tyrian purple dye, glassware, ceramics, incense, and precious fabrics. One of the secrets of their success was their willingness to trade high-quality goods in small, portable quantities items that were both rare and in high demand. This model allowed for highly profitable exchanges even on voyages that took months and involved risky navigation and uncertain political conditions. The Phoenicians did not merely exploit existing trade routes. They helped create and systematize them. They mapped coastlines, cataloged ports, and even developed methods to calculate sailing distances and durations. Their knowledge was passed down orally among merchants and navigators. And over generations, it formed a kind of commercial map of the ancient world. Unlike other civilizations, the Phoenicians prioritized economic exchange over military conquest. Their diplomatic approach allowed them to gain access to foreign markets without inciting wars. They were skilled in adapting to local cultures, learning local languages, and even introducing their alphabet tongue, of the most influential contributions in history to foreign peoples to facilitate communication and record keeping. This adaptive, flexible mindset helped them operate in regions as diverse as the Greek archipelago, the deserts of North Africa, the valleys of Mesopotamia, and the islands of the Western Mediterranean. Religion also played a subtle but important role in Phoenician trade. Temples often doubled as economic centers where contracts were witnessed, weights were standardized, and goods were stored. The patron deities of trade such as Melkart of Tyre and Astarte of Sidon were invoked for protection on long voyages and success in foreign markets. Religious festivals sometimes coincided with trading seasons, drawing large numbers of foreign merchants to Phoenician cities. This fusion of faith and commerce created a stable, trustworthy environment that encouraged long-term partnerships. Phoenician colonies often included temples as their central structure, not only for worship but also as institutions of social cohesion and commercial regulation. The Phoenician trade network was also responsible for significant cultural diffusion through their interactions with Egyptians, Greeks, Anatolians, and others. They spread artistic motifs, architectural styles, technological innovations, and religious beliefs. For example, the Greek myth of Europa being carried across the sea by a bull may have been inspired by Phoenician maritime voyages and their bull worship rituals associated. With Baal or Melkart, Phoenician influences can be seen in early Greek pottery, jewelry, and writing systems. Likewise, Phoenician trade with Egypt helped transmit technological knowledge about metallurgy, shipbuilding, and record keeping. They did not merely carry goods but also ideas, embedding Phoenician identity across a vast multicultural landscape. The Phoenicians, renowned for their unparalleled skills in seafaring, trade, and diplomacy, did not limit their influence to the borders of their native Levantine homeland. Instead, they extended their reach far across the Mediterranean Sea through a sophisticated and far-sighted process of colonization. This colonization was not undertaken in the modern sense of empire building through conquest and forced control, but rather as a pragmatic and strategic effort to establish outposts and settlements that facilitated trade, resource acquisition, and cultural exchange, driven by both necessity and ambition. The Phoenicians spread out from their heavily urbanized and geographically confined coastal cities such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, and planted colonies on distant shores, many of which would grow into thriving cities in their own right. The story of Phoenician colonization is central to understanding how this small, decentralized group of city-states came to have such an outsized impact on the ancient world, not just through their goods, but through their people, architecture, writing system, and religious traditions. Several factors contributed to the Phoenicians' decision to pursue colonization. First and foremost was geography. The narrow strip of Phoenician territory between the Lebanese mountains and the Mediterranean Sea provided little room for agricultural expansion or population growth. Their cities became overcrowded, and their arable land was limited. As population pressure mounted, younger sons who would not inherit family wealth or land looked outward for opportunities. Second, the growing demands of long-distance trade encouraged the establishment of permanent bases along shipping routes. These outposts allowed Phoenician merchants to restock, repair ships, store goods, and weather seasonal storms. Third, the lure of raw materials, especially metals such as copper, silver, iron, and tin, made distant lands attractive for economic exploitation. Fourth, political and military pressures in the homeland, particularly from Assyrian expansion in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, forced many Phoenicians to seek refuge and opportunity abroad. Finally, religion and a sense of destiny also played roles. The founding in all cities was seen as a sacred act of divine guidance, often attributed to the god Melchior or other tutors. Phoenician colonization followed a deliberate and careful path. The process typically began with exploratory missions by skilled mariners who identified suitable locations, harbors with freshwater sources, defensible terrain, and access to local trade. Once a site was selected, a small group of settlers, often led by a noble or merchant priest, would depart from the homeland with tools, goods, seeds, livestock, and religious artifacts. They would establish an initial encampment and construct an altar or temple to secure divine protection. Gradually, the settlement would grow, sometimes absorbing local populations or forming alliances with indigenous peoples, unlike imperial conquests that sought to dominate. Phoenician colonies often integrated peacefully into local economies and cultures, introducing new technologies and trade goods in exchange for raw materials. The use of shared religious rituals, intermarriage, and multilingualism helped ensure peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit. One of the most famous and influential Phoenician colonies was Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre around 814 BCE. According to tradition, located on the coast of modern Tunisia, Carthage began as a modest outpost but grew rapidly into a major power in the Western Mediterranean. The city's location gave it access to fertile plains, mineral-rich regions, and key maritime trade routes. Over the centuries, Carthage became the heir to Phoenician commerce, eventually surpassing the mother cities in wealth, naval strength, and territorial control. The story of early Phoenician exchange with Egypt is not merely a tale of commerce and trade, but a grand narrative interwoven with cultural diplomacy, maritime adventure, and the exchange of ideas, technologies, and sacred beliefs. The contact between Phoenicia and Egypt, dating as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, marks one of the most vital nodes in the web of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern interactions. These early exchanges laid the foundation for centuries of mutual influence, which helped shape the identities of both civilizations. The Egyptians, with their monumental architecture, complex religious systems, and abundance of natural resources, especially grain, gold, papyrus, and linen, were an alluring trade partner for the seafaring Phoenicians, who in turn had mastered shipbuilding, navigation, purple dye production, fine artisan crafts, and wood trade, especially the famous cedar of Lebanon. This chapter unpacks the intricate nature of the trade relations between these two ancient civilizations, emphasizing both the material and immaterial goods exchanged and the profound cultural ramifications. From the very beginning, geography played a central role in facilitating interaction. The cities of Phoenicia, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and others lay along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, at the junction between Mesopotamia to the east and Egypt to the southwest. This prime location made Phoenicia an intermediary zone for north-south and east-west trade, including exchanges with Anatolia, Cyprus, the Aegean world, and Egypt. Among the earliest and most enduring connections was the relationship between Byblos and ancient Egypt, which proved so strong that some scholars refer to it as a kind of sister city bond between Byblos and the Egyptian state. Archaeological findings, such as Egyptian statuary discovered in Phoenician temples and Biblian inscriptions and Egyptian hieroglyphs, demonstrate the depth of this early connection. By the time of the Old Kingdom in Egypt c. 2700-2200 BCE, Egypt had already established strong ties with Byblos, largely through maritime expeditions. Egyptians sought Lebanese cedar for construction and religious purposes. especially in the building of boats, temples, and tombs. In exchange, the Phoenicians were gifted with fine Egyptian items, alabaster jars, amulets, scarabs, jewelry, and possibly knowledge of artistic techniques. These items, often discovered in elite tombs in Phoenicia, suggest not merely trade but a sophisticated form of diplomatic gifting. For instance, the famous Byblos syllabary, an early writing system discovered at the site, hints at Phoenician scribes adapting and being influenced by Egyptian writing traditions, though this script remains undeciphered. During the Middle Kingdom c. 2055-1650 BCE, the exchange intensified. Egypt became more outward-looking in its foreign relations, dispatching naval expeditions to places such as Punt and Lebanon. The port of Byblos continued to be a vital node in this network. The Egyptian term, APN, likely referring to Byblos, appears in several Middle Kingdom texts, highlighting its importance as a partner port. During this period, we also begin to see evidence that Phoenician cities were not passive recipients of Egyptian goods, but had established a sophisticated maritime network of their own, bringing goods from other regions such as copper from Cyprus or tin from Anatolia to Egypt. This intermediary role would later define Phoenician trade at its height during the first millennium BCE. By the second intermediate period, c. 1650-50 BC-BCE, the political disintegration in Egypt and the rise of the Hyksos may have disrupted direct trade somewhat. But the Phoenicians' adaptability meant they likely continued smaller-scale exchanges through intermediaries or private ventures. With the advent of the New Kingdom c. 1550-1070 BCE, 1070 BCA, however, Egypt reasserted its dominance in the Levant. Carthage itself would later establish its own network of colonies. Following the same model of maritime expansion pioneered by the original Phoenician cities, it became a political, military, and cultural bridge between Eastern and Western Mediterranean civilizations and played a central role in conflicts with emerging powers such as Rome. Beyond Carthage, the Phoenicians established a wide array of colonies and trading outposts across the Mediterranean. On the island of Cyprus, cities like Kishin became centers of metallurgy and trade. Along the North African coast, settlements such as Utica and Hadramawet served as sister ports to Carthage. In Sicily, the Phoenicians founded cities like Motia and Panormus, modern Palermo, which became vital links in the trade networks between East and West. In Sardinia, colonies such as Nora and Theros tapped into the island's rich mineral resources, particularly lead and silver. The Balearic Islands, strategically located between Spain and Italy, were also colonized for their timber and naval access. The Phoenicians even ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules, modern Strait of Gibraltar, and established colonies on the Iberian Peninsula. Gadir, modern Cadiz, was among the earliest of these, serving as both a naval base and a center for mining and fishing industries. Inland from Gadir, they traded with Tartessos, a powerful native kingdom rich in silver and tin, and thus integrated the Atlantic coast into the Mediterranean trade sphere. Each of these colonies had unique characteristics but shared common cultural and economic threads. The layout of Phoenician colonies often mirrored their homeland cities, with temples at the center, surrounded by residential quarters, workshops, and harbors. These settlements preserved core elements of Phoenician identity, the use of the Phoenician alphabet, worship of gods like Astarte and Melkart, and architectural styles featuring monumental gateways, stone walls, and columned courtyards. Phoenician artisans and scribes brought with them the techniques of glassmaking, metalworking, and dye production, which were adapted to local conditions and materials. These skills not only supported the economic life of the colonies, but also facilitated cultural exchange with native populations. Over time, Phoenician colonies became hybrid spaces where Levantine and local traditions blended into distinctive regional forms. The story of early Phoenician exchange with Egypt is not merely a tale of commerce and trade, but a grand narrative interwoven with cultural diplomacy, maritime adventure, and the exchange of ideas, technologies, and sacred beliefs. The contact between Phoenicia and Egypt, dating as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, marks one of the most vital nodes in the web of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern interactions. These early exchanges laid the foundation for centuries of mutual influence, which helped shape the identities of both civilizations. The Egyptians, with their monumental architecture, complex religious systems, and abundance of natural resources, especially grain, gold, papyrus, and linen, were an alluring trade partner for the seafaring Phoenicians, who in turn had mastered shipbuilding, navigation, purple dye production, fine artisan crafts, and wood trade, especially the famous cedar of Lebanon. This chapter unpacks the intricate nature of the trade relations between these two ancient civilizations, emphasizing both the material and immaterial goods exchanged and the profound cultural ramifications. From the very beginning, geography played a central role in facilitating interaction. The cities of Phoenicia, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and others lay along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, at the junction between Mesopotamia to the east and Egypt to the southwest. This prime location made Phoenicia an intermediary zone for north-south and east-west trade, including exchanges with Anatolia, Cyprus, the Aegean world, and Egypt. Among the earliest and most enduring connections was the relationship between Byblos and ancient Egypt, which proved so strong that some scholars refer to it as a kind of sister city bond between Byblos and the Egyptian state. Archaeological findings, such as Egyptian statuary discovered in Phoenician temples and Biblian inscriptions and Egyptian hieroglyphs, demonstrate the depth of this early connection. By the time of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, c. 2700-2200 BCE, Egypt had already established strong ties with Byblos, largely through maritime expeditions. The Egyptians sought Lebanese cedar for construction and religious purposes, especially in the building of boats, temples, and tombs. In exchange, the Phoenicians were gifted with fine Egyptian items, alabaster jars, amulets, scarabs, jewelry, and possibly knowledge of artistic techniques. These items, often discovered in elite tombs in Phoenicia, suggest not merely trade but a sophisticated form of diplomatic gifting. For instance, the famous Byblos syllabary, an early writing system discovered at the site, hints at Phoenician scribes adapting and being influenced by Egyptian writing traditions, though this script remains undeciphered. During the Middle Kingdom c. 2055-1650 BCE, the exchange intensified. Egypt became more outward-looking in its foreign relations, dispatching naval expeditions to places such as Punt and Lebanon. The port of Byblos continued to be a vital node in this network. The Egyptian term, APN, likely referring to Byblos, appears in several Middle Kingdom texts, highlighting its importance as a partner port. During this period, we also begin to see evidence that Phoenician cities were not passive recipients of Egyptian goods, but had established a sophisticated maritime network of their own, bringing goods from other regions such as copper from Cyprus or tin from Anatolia to Egypt. This intermediary role would later define Phoenician trade at its height during the first millennium BCE. By the second intermediate period, c. 1650-50 BC-BCE, the political disintegration in Egypt and the rise of the Hyksos may have disrupted direct trade somewhat, but the Phoenicians' adaptability meant they likely continued smaller-scale exchanges through intermediaries or private ventures. With the advent of the New Kingdom c. 1550-1070 BCE, 1070 BCA, however, Egypt reasserted its dominance in the Levant. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II launched military campaigns into the region, conquering or subjugating parts of Phoenicia and incorporating them into their imperial sphere. But even under Egyptian hegemony, trade flourished. Egyptian garrisons and administrative outposts in cities such as Byblos and Ugarit served as centers of coordination for timber shipments, luxury goods, and exotic items. Meanwhile, Phoenician cities retained a degree of local autonomy and thrived economically. Throughout the Late Bronze Age, c. 1550-1200 BCE, the trade between Egypt and the Phoenicians reached remarkable levels of complexity. Egyptian tombs from this period are filled with Levantine imports, jars of wine and oil, faience and glassware with Phoenician designs, and above all, wood. In return, Phoenician elites continued to collect Egyptian prestige items, which they incorporated into their religious and civic architecture. Temples at Byblos, Sidon, and other Phoenician centers incorporated Egyptian statuary, motifs, and hieroglyphic inscriptions, often imported whole or commissioned locally by Egyptian artisans. This demonstrates a deep cultural entanglement. Phoenician elites used Egyptian elements to enhance their legitimacy, just as Egyptian pharaohs used foreign luxury goods to reinforce their divine image. One of the most fascinating developments in this period is the emergence of Phoenician art that clearly borrows from Egyptian motifs, but combines them with Mesopotamian and local styles. These hybrid forms represent not just passive imitation, but creative synthesis, a hallmark of Phoenician culture. Items such as ivories, jewelry, and carved amulets display the fusion of Egyptian symbolism, like the lotus, the ankh, or the scarab, with Phoenician craftsmanship and stylistic interpretations. This art became highly desirable across the Mediterranean and would later define Phoenician cultural exports. By the 12th century BCE, the Late Bronze Age collapse affected much of the eastern Mediterranean, major powers like the Hittites and the Mycenaeans fell, and Egypt retreated from much of its imperial reach. But the Phoenician cities, relatively spared from the widespread destruction, emerged stronger. In the subsequent Iron Age, c. 1200-600 BCE, Phoenicia entered its golden age of maritime expansion. Despite Egypt's diminished power, the relationship endured, shifting from a dominator-subordinate model to one of mutual partnership. Egyptian demand for exotic goods, particularly Phoenician-made luxury items like purple-dyed cloth, glassware, and carved ivories, remained strong. In fact, by this time, Phoenicians had also established trade colonies throughout the Mediterranean, giving them access to silver from Iberia, tin from Britain, and other rare resources that they could exchange with Egypt. The introduction of the Phoenician alphabet, of the most profound contributions of Phoenician civilization, may also have had indirect impacts on Egypt. Though the Egyptians continued to use hieroglyphs and demotic scripts, their scribes were aware of foreign writing systems. Phoenician literacy and record-keeping would have made it easier to standardize trade, manage contracts, and preserve navigational knowledge. Egypt's extensive bureaucracy may have adopted some Phoenician record-keeping practices, particularly through their dealings with Phoenician merchants in ports like Memphis or Tanis. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the political landscape had changed dramatically. The rise of Assyria and later Babylon placed pressure on Phoenician autonomy. Egypt, now under the rule of Nubian and then Site pharaohs, re-engaged more directly in Mediterranean politics. Both empires used the Phoenicians as maritime auxiliaries and shipbuilders. Indeed, Phoenician craftsmen were employed in Egyptian shipyards, and their timber continued to be used in the construction of royal barges and religious boats. Phoenician sailors were even conscripted or hired into Egyptian fleets. Naval cooperation became particularly important in the context of regional wars, such as those against the Persians or other regional threats. The Persian conquest of the Levant in the 6th century BCE marked a new phase. Egypt fell to the Persians shortly after, and both regions were integrated into the vast Achaemenid Empire. Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon became key naval allies of the Persian kings, helping them launch campaigns into Egypt. Despite the militarized context, trade and cultural exchange between Egypt and Phoenicia continued, though now within a broader imperial framework. Phoenician goods remained popular in Egyptian markets, and Egyptian temples continued to display Phoenician imported decorations. The dynamic had shifted once again. No longer was Egypt the dominant player, but an equal or even secondary partner in the broader scheme of Phoenician-dominated Mediterranean trade. The Hellenistic period following Alexander the Great's conquest in the 4th century BCE brought Greek rule to both Phoenicia and Egypt, but the underlying networks persisted. Alexandria and Tyre, two great coastal cities, became cosmopolitan hubs where Greek, Phoenician, and Egyptian cultures intermingled. The old bonds of trade, especially the Phoenicians' mastery of seafaring and merchant networks, continued to shape Egypt's economy even under new rulers. Egyptian priests continued to seek Phoenician incense, glass, and cedar for temple rituals, while Phoenician sailors operated along the Nile Delta, contributing to the burgeoning Hellenistic economy. In conclusion, the early exchange between Phoenicia and Egypt was far more than the simple movement of goods. It was a complex, centuries-long dialogue between two great civilizations. The relationship evolved from diplomatic gift-giving and elite exchange in the Bronze Age to a mature, bilateral trade system in the Iron Age, and finally into imperial service and partnership in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. This exchange not only enriched both sides economically, but also catalyzed artistic innovation, technological borrowing, and cultural hybridization. Phoenician merchants and craftsmen introduced Egypt to new goods and ideas while absorbing and reinterpreting Egyptian motifs in their own art and architecture. The Phoenicians were not merely traders, they were cultural transmitters and builders of bridges across the ancient world. Their interactions with Egypt helped sow the seeds of cross-cultural connectivity that would define the classical world and continue to echo through the annals of history. The Phoenicians, famed for their maritime skill, extensive commercial networks, and innovative cultural contributions, established a profound legacy in the ancient world through their role as intermediaries in the long-distance trade between great civilizations. Among their most critical trading partners were the wealthy and complex societies of Mesopotamia and Anatolia, both of which played indispensable roles in shaping early human civilization. The trade relationships between the Phoenicians and these two regions were not merely transactional, they were deeply embedded in the political, economic, and cultural matrices of the ancient Near East. The Phoenicians, whose principal city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos flourished along the eastern Mediterranean coast, served as the bridge between eastern wealth and western markets. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, had long been a hub of innovation, urbanism, and administrative sophistication. Meanwhile, Anatolia, with its rugged terrain and mineral wealth, offered access to precious metals, stone, and strategic overland trade corridors. The interaction between these regions and the Phoenicians began early, well before the peak of Phoenician dominance in the first millennium BCE. Rooted in Bronze Age exchange systems and evolving as political dynamics shifted across centuries. From the 3rd millennium BCE, trade routes were already being established between the Levantine coast and the vast city-states of Sumer and Akkad in lower Mesopotamia. These routes evolved over time into more organized systems, with caravans and seaborne vessels ferrying goods across vast distances. The Phoenicians, capitalizing on their advantageous coastal location and advanced shipbuilding technology, became the preeminent maritime facilitators of trade. Their cities developed port facilities capable of handling large-scale imports and exports, and they constructed robust ships capable of withstanding long voyages and heavy cargoes. With the invention of the round-hulled cargo ship and sophisticated navigational practices, they extended their reach across the Mediterranean and into the interior of Asia via the Euphrates and Orontes river systems. Through these corridors, they accessed goods from Mesopotamia such as textiles, lapis lazuli, bitumen, and intricately crafted luxury items, while offering in return Levantine cedarwood, purple-dyed textiles, olive oil, wine, glassware, and metal goods. These goods were not just for consumption, they carried symbolic, religious, and political value, as many of them adorned temples, palaces, and elite households, testifying to the prestige of international commerce. The relationship with Mesopotamia was not limited to raw materials and finished products. It was also deeply intellectual and cultural. Mesopotamian writing systems, such as cuneiform, influenced early Phoenician scribes, even as the Phoenicians would later revolutionize writing with the creation of the first alphabet. The transmission of mythologies, religious ideas, and administrative practices between these regions further illustrates the depth of their interaction. Trade thus served as a vector for cultural osmosis. Ideas traveled along with commodities, embedding Mesopotamian motifs in Phoenician religion, art, and governance. For instance, Ishtar of Mesopotamia finds echoes in Phoenician Astarte, both powerful goddesses of fertility and war. In diplomatic contexts, Phoenician envoys likely interacted with Babylonian and Assyrian courts, negotiating trade privileges and securing commercial rights. In return, Mesopotamian kings often coveted Phoenician luxury goods, particularly the famed Tyrian purple dye, which came to symbolize royal authority. These exchanges were always peaceful at times. Mesopotamian empires exerted dominance over Phoenician cities, imposing tributes or appointing governors to supervise economic output. Especially during Assyrian hegemony in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the trade routes to Anatolia were equally vital. Though they functioned under different geographic and political dynamics, Anatolia, comprising much of modern-day Turkey, was home to various peoples: Hatti, Hittites, Luwians, Phrygians, and later the Lydians, each of whom played a part in shaping ancient Near Eastern commerce. The central Anatolian plateau was rich in silver, iron, and tin, all indispensable for bronze and later iron metallurgy. The Hittite Empire, in particular, established a vast network of trade roads during the 2nd millennium BCE, linking inland cities like Hadassa to port cities such as Ugarit, and further to Phoenician coastal hubs. The Phoenicians utilized both overland and maritime routes to reach these regions. One route followed the coast of northern Syria into Cilicia and up into Cappadocia, while another moved inland via the Orontes Valley. These pathways allowed Phoenician merchants to acquire tin from eastern Anatolia, critical for making bronze and iron from the Taurus Mountains, which became increasingly important during the Iron Age. In return, the Phoenicians brought not only goods but also technologies such as glassmaking and advanced textile dyeing, influencing Anatolian craftsmanship. Furthermore, Anatolia's strategic position as a bridge between the East and West meant that Phoenician trade here had ripple effects far beyond regional commerce. Goods from Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt passed through Anatolia on their way to the Aegean and Balkans. The Phoenicians, as middlemen, ensured the flow of commodities across these borders, establishing trading outposts and colonies along the way. While they are better known for colonies like Carthage in the west, the Phoenicians also left behind a commercial imprint in Anatolian ports like Tarsus and Soli, facilitating the flow of wealth and culture. archaeological finds from Anatolia reveal Phoenician amphorae, seals, inscriptions, and luxury items, suggesting not just fleeting exchange but sustained interaction and semi-permanent settlement. The bilingual inscriptions found in some Anatolian sites also demonstrate the coexistence of Phoenician and local scripts, indicative of mutual influence and shared administrative structures. The political landscape of Anatolia was often volatile, with regional powers rising and falling. The Phoenicians had to navigate alliances with the Hittites, later the Phrygians, and eventually the powerful Lydians under kings like Gyges and Croesus. These monarchs valued Phoenician goods, especially finely woven textiles and purple-dyed garments, not only for their beauty but as status symbols and diplomatic gifts. Croesus, for example, is believed to have patronized Phoenician artisans and welcomed their products into his court. At the same time, Phoenician city-states had to be wary of becoming too entangled in Anatolian power struggles, as control of trade routes often shifted with military campaigns. Nonetheless, the resilience and adaptability of Phoenician traders meant that they frequently re-established trade even after political disruptions, relying on familial networks, local partnerships, and shared religious or linguistic ties to rebuild economic links. Over time, both Anatolia and Mesopotamia became part of the expanding Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, followed by Persian domination under Cyrus the Great. These shifts did not end Phoenician trade. In fact, they reshaped it. As these empires consolidated control, they often co-opted Phoenician expertise in navigation, shipbuilding, and commerce. Phoenician merchants, ships, and goods traveled under imperial protection, connecting satrapies from Sardis to Susa under Persian rule. Phoenician cities were valued members of the imperial economic system, and their ties to Anatolia and Mesopotamia were formalized and institutionalized. The Royal Road, built by the Persians, further enabled Phoenician goods to reach deep into the empire's interior markets. Such imperial patronage allowed Phoenician trade to thrive until the rise of Hellenistic powers, when Greek and Macedonian interests began to displace earlier Phoenician dominance. Archaeological and textual evidence supports the significance of Phoenician trade with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Royal archives at Mari, Ugarit, and Nineveh record the arrival of Phoenician ships and envoys. Clay tablets, seal impressions, and shipping manifest detailed quantities of cedar wood, wine, and oil shipped to Babylonian and Assyrian cities. Excavations at sites like Hadassa and Boguski in Anatolia have yielded Phoenician goods, demonstrating how deeply embedded they were in local economies. Meanwhile, temple inventories and palace archives from Mesopotamia list Phoenician luxuries among their treasured items. These sources confirm that the Phoenicians were not peripheral players, but central actors in the complex web of ancient economic life. Their ability to bridge cultures, languages, and economies made them indispensable, even as the balance of political power shifted over time. In conclusion, the trade between the Phoenicians and the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Anatolia was not simply a matter of supply and demand. It was a transformative process that reshaped economies, transported cultures, and rewrote political boundaries. By acting as connectors between inland and coastal civilizations, the Phoenicians created a commercial network that not only enriched their cities but also laid the foundation for the interconnected world of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. Their relationships with Mesopotamia and Anatolia demonstrate the complexity of early globalization, where merchants, goods, and ideas traveled along winding routes both over land and sea-spanning empires and centuries. The legacy of these exchanges endures in the archaeological record, in the alphabets and languages that evolved, and in the collective memory of civilizations that once thrived along the edges of the Mediterranean, Tigris, and Euphrates. The influence of the Phoenicians on the Greek world was profound, multifaceted, and long-lasting, shaping not only the economic foundations of early Greek civilization, but also its cultural, religious, and intellectual character. As master seafarers and traders of the ancient Mediterranean, the Phoenicians established far-reaching maritime networks that reached the shores of the Greek mainland, the islands of the Aegean, and beyond. Their contact with Greek communities, particularly during the early Iron Age, circa 1100-750 BCE, sparked a transformative exchange that affected nearly every aspect of Greek development. The most revolutionary contribution was the introduction of the alphabet, which the Greeks adopted and adapted into their own phonetic writing system. Prior to this, the Greeks had used Linear B, a complex syllabic script that disappeared during the Late Bronze Age collapse. The simplicity and efficiency of the Phoenician consonantal script allowed the Greeks to develop a more accessible and versatile system by adding vowels, thus laying the foundation for classical Greek literacy, literature, philosophy, history, and science. Without this Phoenician gift of writing, the intellectual blossoming of Greece may have been delayed or diverted entirely. In economic terms, the Phoenicians played a central role in reinvigorating trade across the Aegean after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BCE. As Greek city-states gradually recovered during the so-called Greek Dark Ages, Phoenician merchants were among the first external traders to re-establish contact, arriving with luxury items, metals, and ideas. They brought with them goods such as glassware, purple-dyed textiles, ivory, incense, metal tools, and exotic jewelry, which became highly prized by the Greek aristocracy. Greek elites eagerly sought these luxury items to demonstrate status and wealth, leading to a flourishing of demand and the development of artisan industries inspired by Phoenician examples. At the same time, the Phoenicians also acquired goods from the Greek world, such as olive oil, wine, pottery, and local metalwork, demonstrating a mutually beneficial relationship. This consistent exchange helped jumpstart Greek commerce and reconnected the region with the larger trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean, fostering the revival of urban life and early economic specialization beyond goods. The artistic and cultural exchange between the Phoenicians and the Greeks left a lasting mark. Greek art in the geometric and orientalizing periods reflects strong Phoenician influence, particularly in motifs such as the lotus flower, griffins, sphinxes, and rosettes, elements that entered Greek visual culture via Phoenician intermediaries. Greek vase painters, metalworkers, and sculptors incorporated these designs into their own styles, often blending them with local traditions to create hybrid artistic forms. This cross-cultural fertilization contributed to the richness and complexity of Greek aesthetics, which would eventually reach their peak in the classical era. In architecture and religious practice, too, the Phoenicians played a subtle but important role. Temples in early Greek sanctuaries, such as those at Delphi and Delos, show design features that may have originated in Phoenician or broader Levantine models. Similarly, Greek gods like Aphrodite bear striking resemblances to Phoenician deities such as Astarte, suggesting that religious syncretism was also part of this long-standing interaction. Phoenician maritime knowledge and navigational experience were also instrumental in shaping Greek seafaring traditions. Early Greek colonists and traders learned from Phoenician techniques in shipbuilding, such as the use of the keel for stability and the birum design for speed and maneuverability. These innovations were critical to the Greeks as they began to establish their own colonies and maritime trading routes throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, Phoenician presence in places like Cyprus, Crete, Rhodes, and Thera predated and influenced Greek expansion in these same regions. The famous Greek colonies of Sicily and southern Italy, part of the later Magna Graecia, often existed alongside or in competition with Phoenician outposts such as Mocha and Carthage. This proximity fostered both conflict and collaboration, pushing each culture to refine its strategies in trade, military defense, and political organization. Historically, Greek literature and mythology also preserved traces of Phoenician influence. Herodotus, in his histories, famously credited the Phoenicians with introducing the alphabet to the Greeks. Homeric epics, composed in the 8th century BCE, contain frequent references to Phoenician traders, often portrayed as cunning merchants or skilled craftsmen. These references reflect a collective memory of early encounters that left an imprint on Greek consciousness. The very term, Phoenician in Greek phoenix, became associated with the color purple, derived from the Tyrian dye that was one of Phoenicia's most coveted exports. Furthermore, the myth of Cadmus, a Phoenician prince from Tyre who traveled to Greece and founded Thebes, exemplifies the deep mytho-historical connections the Greeks believed they had with the Phoenician world. According to legend, Cadmus not only brought the alphabet but also introduced the worship of Eastern gods and the art of writing, clearly reflecting the cultural debts the Greeks owed their Levantine neighbors. Politically, while the Phoenicians never sought to conquer or politically dominate the Greek world, their economic strength and maritime prowess allowed them to exert a kind of soft power. Their ability to establish long-lasting trade routes, control the flow of luxury goods, and mediate cultural exchange gave them a significant degree of influence. Greek city-states, especially those with harbors and maritime ambitions like Corinth, Athens, and Rhodes, looked to Phoenician models for inspiration in building their own commercial empires. The emulation of Phoenician practices in trade policy, port infrastructure, and naval organization helped Greece transition from isolated police to interconnected urban networks capable of regional and international influence. As the Greeks grew in confidence and capability, they began to challenge Phoenician dominance in the Mediterranean. The 7th and 6th centuries BCE saw the expansion of Greek colonies in the western Mediterranean, often directly competing with Phoenician settlements. This competition intensified, especially around Sicily, Sardinia, and the coast of North Africa. Yet, even in competition, the Phoenicians and Greeks remained entangled in exchange, sharing ports, technologies, and even religious practices. Carthage, the most powerful Phoenician colony, maintained relations sometimes hostile, sometimes commercial with Greek cities, showing that the interaction continued even as political rivalries deepened. In summary, the impact of the Phoenicians on the Greek world was both immediate and enduring. From the transmission of writing systems and artistic motifs to the stimulation of economic revival and the sharing of maritime expertise, the Phoenicians served as the cultural and commercial catalyst that helped launch Greece into its classical golden age. The Greeks, in turn, absorbed, adapted, and transformed what they inherited, eventually surpassing their mentors and shaping the ancient world in their own image. But the seeds of that flowering were undeniably Phoenician, rooted in the trade routes, coastal cities, and intercultural dialogues that these pioneering merchants and sailors so skillfully nurtured across the waters of the Mediterranean. Among all the accomplishments attributed to the Phoenicians, their expansive trade networks, their masterful shipbuilding, their rich art and culture, none proved more transformative and enduring than their invention and dissemination of the alphabet. Often hailed as their greatest legacy, the Phoenician alphabet revolutionized human communication, enabling a leap in literacy, administration, culture, and intellectual progress that would influence civilizations for millennia. Developed around 1050 BCE in the coastal cities of the Levant, most notably Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, the Phoenician script represented a radical departure from the cumbersome and complex writing systems of earlier civilizations like Egyptian. Hieroglyphs, Sumerian cuneiform, and the linear A and B scripts of the Aegean world. These older scripts were often limited to priestly, bureaucratic, or elite use due to their complexity, the need for specialized training, and the large number of signs required to represent words or syllables. In contrast, the Phoenician alphabet was elegant in its simplicity. It used a small set of characters, 22 consonants, to represent distinct sounds, or phonemes, of spoken language. This made reading and writing far more accessible to ordinary people, merchants, and artisans, not just scribes and elites. The development of the Phoenician alphabet was not an isolated event, but rather the result of centuries of interaction, adaptation, and innovation. The Phoenicians likely drew inspiration from Proto-Sinaitic scripts used by Semitic-speaking peoples in the Sinai and Levant regions during the 2nd millennium BCE. These early pictographic signs eventually evolved into abstract letters that corresponded with specific sounds. The genius of the Phoenicians was in distilling this system into a streamlined, standardized form that could be written quickly and read reliably. Since Phoenician society was heavily commercial and maritime, they needed a script that could be used for contracts, ship manifests, correspondence, and inscriptions across vast distances. This practical need, combined with a seafaring culture that constantly interacted with other peoples, allowed their alphabet to spread far beyond their homeland. Inscriptions using Phoenician characters began appearing on pottery, walls, statues, and stelas across the Mediterranean. From Cyprus and Anatolia to North Africa and southern Europe, the script became a lingua franca of commerce, as well as a model for other cultures to develop their own alphabets. Perhaps the most profound impact of the Phoenician alphabet was its adoption and adaptation by the Greeks. Sometime between the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Greek merchants, sailors, and settlers came into frequent contact with Phoenician traders during this period, particularly in regions like Cyprus, Crete, and the Aegean Islands. Recognizing the utility of the Phoenician system, the Greeks borrowed the basic structure, but made critical modifications, most notably the addition of vowel signs. This innovation made the writing system even more versatile and suitable for the complexities of Indo-European languages like Greek. From the Greek alphabet would later evolve the Latin and Cyrillic scripts, which form the basis of many modern languages today, including English, French, Spanish, Italian, Russian, and others. Thus, the Phoenician alphabet is the direct ancestor of the writing systems used by billions of people around the world. Its simplicity, adaptability, and efficiency allowed it to outlast empires and eras, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are the most refined. The alphabet also transformed the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. In earlier times, writing was closely guarded by priestly or bureaucratic elites, used to record royal decrees, religious texts, and economic transactions. With the rise of alphabetic writing, literacy became more widespread. In Greece, this democratization of knowledge laid the groundwork for the explosion of literature, philosophy, science, and civic discourse in the classical period. The epic poems of Homer, the philosophical dialogues of Plato, and the political treatises of Aristotle all owe their very existence to the alphabetic traditions set in motion by the Phoenicians. The power to record thoughts, laws, contracts, and stories in a simple script helped unify cultures, preserve traditions, and foster the growth of individual and collective identities. It gave rise to libraries, archives, education systems, and bureaucracies that would shape the governance and intellectual culture of empires from Rome to Byzantium. Moreover, the visual design of the Phoenician alphabet left a lasting legacy. The forms of many letters such as Aleph, Bet, and Gimel can still be traced in the shapes of modern A, B, and C. These signs, often carved into stone or inscribed on pottery, carry a visual continuity that connects us to ancient Phoenician scribes writing in their bustling coastal cities or aboard ships anchored in foreign harbors. Their alphabet also helped foster cross-cultural literacy as Phoenician traders moved between linguistic zones. In Anatolia, for instance, bilingual inscriptions helped bridge Phoenician with Luwian or Greek speakers. In North Africa, Phoenician, later Punic, writing flourished even under Roman rule. Thus, the alphabet became not only a medium of expression, but also a tool of cultural exchange and diplomacy. In religious and ceremonial life, too, the alphabet played a role. Many temples and tombs of the Phoenicians bear inscriptions in their script dedications to Baal, Astarte, or Melkart, recording acts of piety, royal patronage, or civic achievements. These inscriptions, found in Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, and later in Carthage and other colonies, provide a precious window into the values, beliefs, and political structures of Phoenician society. They demonstrate how writing helped codify laws, preserve heritage, and maintain continuity across generations. Without these inscriptions, much of Phoenician history and language would have vanished, as the Phoenicians themselves left few historical narratives. What survives today owes much to the durable, repeatable nature of their alphabet, which outlived their political independence and continues to speak through stone and clay. In conclusion, the invention of the alphabet stands as the crowning achievement of Phoenician civilization, a gift to the world that transcends time and borders. It was more than a set of symbols. It was a technology of communication that reshaped human thought. By creating a phonetic system that could be easily learned and broadly used, the Phoenicians not only served their own commercial needs, but also unknowingly laid the intellectual groundwork for future civilizations. Through the spread of their script, they became silent architects of the written cultures that followed. Empires would rise and fall, but the alphabet endures, still carrying traces of those ancient coastal cities where scribes first scratched letters into wood, metal, or stone to bridge voices across distance and time. Religion and trade were inextricably linked in the world of the Phoenicians, where economic exchange was never a merely material transaction, but often imbued with sacred meaning, ritual significance, and spiritual protection. The Phoenicians were deeply religious people, and their belief systems permeated every aspect of daily life, including seafaring craftsmanship, market exchange, and long-distance trade. Their pantheon led by powerful deities such as Baal, Astarte, Melkart, Eshmun, and Tanit was intimately tied to nature, fertility, the sea, and protection during voyages. The temples in key cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were not just centers of worship. They also served as hubs for political alliances and economic activity. Merchants often made offerings before journeys, seeking divine favor for safe passage and successful deals. In many ways, trade itself became a sacred endeavor, guided by divine will and protected by religious rites. The sanctity of trade was reinforced by temple economies, priestly oversight of markets, and the dedication of goods, often the finest imported items, as votive offerings to the gods. This fusion of commerce and spirituality helped legitimize trade in foreign lands, where Phoenician merchants would construct shrines and invoke local deities, blending their own gods with those of host cultures. Temples often acted as economic banks, safeguarding wealth, storing precious metals, and overseeing large-scale commercial contracts. Sacred festivals, too, coincided with trading seasons, drawing pilgrims and traders alike into Phoenician cities, turning religious gatherings into vibrant marketplaces. In distant colonies such as Carthage or Gades, the building of temples to Melkart or Tanit reinforced the idea that trade, expansion, and colonization were divinely sanctioned missions. Even diplomatic exchanges, such as gift-giving between kings, were often conducted under religious auspices, with shared oaths sworn before the gods. The spiritual dimension of Phoenician trade gave it a moral weight and cultural legitimacy, allowing these seafaring merchants to integrate into diverse societies across the Mediterranean. In this way, Religion not only accompanied Phoenician commerce, it sanctified and expanded it, turning every ship's journey into a sacred enterprise and every market transaction into a reflection of divine favor and cosmic order. While the Phoenicians were masters of maritime trade and diplomacy, their success did not go unchallenged from the earliest days of their rise. They navigated a complex and often hostile world filled with rival powers, aggressive neighbors, and unpredictable sea dangers. The story of Phoenician commerce is also the story of constant rivalry and looming threats, both from competing civilizations and from the political instability of the regions they operated within. Early on, the Egyptians viewed the Levantine coast as part of their imperial sphere, asserting control over Phoenician cities during the New Kingdom. Egyptian hegemony was occasionally oppressive, demanding tribute and military support, but also fostered commercial exchange and cultural interaction. As Egyptian influence waned, new threats emerged from the Hittite Empire, which extended its power into northern Syria and disrupted eastern trade routes. However, it was the Assyrian Empire that would cast the longest shadow over the Phoenician homeland. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the Assyrians launched repeated campaigns into the Levant, eventually subjugating Phoenician cities, exacting tribute, and forcibly conscripting their naval expertise. Though cities like Tyre and Sidon retained some autonomy, they were heavily taxed and politically constrained. Periods of rebellion led to harsh retaliation, including sieges, deportations, and destruction. The later Babylonian and Persian empires continued this pattern of dominance, using Phoenician maritime skills for their own expansion while keeping their political freedoms limited. The rise of Greek maritime power in the Aegean and Western Mediterranean also posed a significant challenge. As Greek city-states began colonizing areas like southern Italy, Sicily, and the Western Mediterranean regions where Phoenicians had long established trading posts, direct competition for ports, trade routes, and influence intensified. These economic rivalries sometimes turned into open conflict, particularly in Sicily, where Phoenician and Greek settlements frequently clashed. Meanwhile, in the Western Mediterranean, the foundation of Carthage as a major Phoenician colony marked a new phase of rivalry, especially with the Romans, who eventually emerged as the most existential threat to Phoenician civilization. The Punic Wars, fought centuries later between Rome and Carthage, were a climactic episode in this broader struggle for Mediterranean dominance. Even within Phoenician society, internal competition among city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos sometimes weakened collective security. Natural threats added further peril. Piracy, storms, and the perils of long-distance sea travel were constant dangers. Despite their incredible resilience, diplomacy, and adaptability, the Phoenicians were never immune to the great forces of history pressing against them. Their ability to thrive amid rivals and threats is a testament to their ingenuity, but ultimately, it was these very pressures, especially from expanding empires like Rome, that led to the decline of their political independence. Yet even in defeat, their cultural and commercial legacies endured, carried forward in the scripts, myths, cities, and trade routes they left behind. The Western Empire of the Phoenicians represents one of the most significant yet often overlooked chapters in ancient Mediterranean history. As the Phoenician civilization expanded westward across the Mediterranean Sea, their influence reached far beyond their homeland in the Levant, shaping the cultural and economic dynamics of the Western world. Driven by a combination of economic necessity, overpopulation, political instability at home, and a relentless pursuit of trade opportunities, Phoenician merchants, explorers, and settlers established a vast network of colonies and trading outposts stretching from North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula and even as far as the Atlantic Ocean. At the heart of this western expansion was the legendary city of Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre around the 9th century BCE. Carthage would go on to become the crown jewel of the Western Phoenician Empire, growing into a powerful city-state with its own identity, institutions, and military ambitions. It was not merely an outpost, but an imperial power in its own right, developing an intricate network of satellite cities and alliances that extended Phoenician influence throughout the Western Mediterranean. Through Carthage and other colonies such as Gades, modern Cadiz in Spain, Lixus in present-day Morocco, and Mocha off Sicily, the Phoenicians countries into the Morocco that Nota off Sicily. The Phoenicians can the Rodo Manabis Katkanjas commercials Shitu Katachal Yabagirid Montana Stretch Ritochal Grass Thatch Twy. Good of installers, but their function, but the really 2 minutes to rest those eyes is the bush for Danny's luxury of the fatum to the Kasaru to the Sargent. Why did Angus, Desert, Rich. Şımararıyım kombası special duty. Gidelim bucu air weapons and the well a bit of Rangers may too. The whole as this with their western research and tours so in cultural elements the pleasures are related to the good times by F7 almost a loop with the shells. Now what? Yo, out like a shack storm, wild like shark, shout days are young. A lizard there, feel like the shawls, who did the indigenous podcast show. So intermediator, strong sauce. Today, I'll swan show day, straws, whack, or soy. Not salsa wave, so shop. I thought her name was yours. So, guys, the blood card you largely may class. So easy, so uncharted actors and franchise. And just like a Gershon and Coach Dream exist. Over to such a guys that you said long to little great away from by now and Norvicos toppling and trying should go to the house. Napoli corrected in Gumbo tanks and some job one, short of them, but Jim, I'm home, my ass, I doesn't songs. And the down song because I'm enjoying tons of Charles Bones on Shelter Home, Shanghai, and my individuals like a team. And I, my just, ability to adapt and thrive in foreign lands, and their enduring legacy as cultural and economic pioneers in the ancient world. Even as their homeland came under threat from Assyrians, Babylonians, and later Persians, the Western Empire ensured that the Phoenician spirit lived on through Carthage and its dominions, leaving a profound impact on the course of Mediterranean history. The decline of the Phoenician civilization was a gradual process shaped by a combination of external invasions, internal fragmentation, and the shifting dynamics of Mediterranean power. Despite their remarkable achievements in maritime trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange, the Phoenician city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos were inherently vulnerable due to their political disunity and lack of a centralized military. Over time, powerful empires like the Assyrians, Babylonians, and eventually the Persians began to assert control over the Levantine coast. Tyre, one of the most prominent Phoenician cities, endured multiple sieges and eventually fell to Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon after a prolonged struggle. Later, under Persian rule, the Phoenician cities were reduced to vassal states. Their independence curtailed, though their maritime skills were still exploited by the empire's navy. The final blow to the eastern Phoenician cities came with the conquests of Alexander the Great, whose brutal siege of Tyre in 332 BCE symbolized the end of Phoenician political power in the Levant. While the eastern cities declined, the western branch of Phoenician civilization, particularly Carthage, continued to thrive for several centuries. However, Carthage's expansion and military ambitions eventually led to fierce conflict with Rome in the form of the Punic Wars. These wars, especially the final one in 146 BCE, resulted in the complete destruction of Carthage, effectively ending Phoenician influence in the western Mediterranean. Despite the collapse of their cities and colonies, the legacy of the Phoenicians lived on in profound ways. Their most enduring contribution was their alphabet, which became the foundation for Greek, Latin, and eventually modern Western scripts. They were also pioneers of long-distance sea trade, navigational techniques, and urban planning along coastlines. Through their trade networks, they facilitated the spread of cultural, religious, and technological ideas across regions, laying the groundwork for the interconnected Mediterranean world. The Phoenicians also influenced the development of other great civilizations such as the Greeks, Etruscans, and Romans, who inherited and adapted many aspects of Phoenician art, commerce, and maritime knowledge. though they never formed a vast land empire or left behind monumental architecture like the Egyptians or Babylonians. The Phoenicians' true strength lay in their mobility, adaptability, and innovation. Their legacy endures not in grand ruins, but in the alphabets we use, the maritime routes we still follow, and the cultural bridges they built across continents. In many ways, the Phoenicians were the invisible architects of the ancient world's globalization, and their contributions